It begins in silence, a dark room, lit only by the dim flicker of candles, their wax dripping slowly onto a wooden table. The air is thick with the smell of ink and smoke. A man bends low over parchment, his quill scratching feverishly, his face half-shadowed, half-illuminated by the wavering flame. His name is Michel de Nostradamus, though history will remember him by another, Nostradamus. Tonight, as in so many nights before, he writes in riddles, verses that seem neither of his world nor of his time. His hand trembles slightly, not from age, though he is no longer young, but from something deeper. He feels as though he is not the one writing. Rather, he is a vessel. Words pour through him like visions half seen in dreams, like whispers borrowed from a future not yet born. Outside, the world is unraveling. The year is the middle of the 16th century, a time when France is torn by plague, famine, and endless wars of religion. Whole villages are swallowed by death, streets are filled with bodies carried out for burning, and in the cities, whispers of witchcraft and heresy echo louder than prayers. People fear the end of days, and perhaps they are right to fear. It is in this atmosphere of terror and uncertainty that Nostradamus writes, cloaking his visions in quatrains, 4-line poems cryptic enough to survive censors, but haunting enough to stir dread in the hearts of those who read them. Imagine sitting in that candlelit chamber as the words take form. The young lion will overcome the old one on the field of combat in a single battle, a riddle, a fragment, but one that centuries later will be tied to the violent death of a king. Even now, the words seem to shimmer with a strange power, as if the ink itself carries a curse. His verses are filled with blood, fire, floods, and the rise and fall of tyrants. Some say they are warnings, others that they are puzzles, and some believe they are proof that a man could look beyond the veil of time. Yet Nostradamus was no simple fortune-teller, no carnival seer playing tricks with cards and smoke. He was a physician, a man of science by the standards of his day. He fought against plague, studied the stars, and experimented with herbs. But even as he healed bodies, he was haunted by visions. He gazed at the night sky not only for medicine, but for signs. Astrology, astronomy, prophecy, all blurred together in his restless mind. He saw patterns where others saw chaos, connections where others saw coincidence. And slowly, his reputation grew. Some feared him, some revered him, but all were intrigued by him. The irony of Nostradamus' life is that though he became a symbol of prophecy, he was also a product of his time, a time when people desperately wanted to believe that the future could be read, that destiny could be known. Europe was obsessed with signs and portents. Comets streaking the skies, eclipses blotting out the sun, the sudden outbreak of plague. Every event seemed like a message from God or a warning of damnation. Into this climate of fear, Nostradamus' words fell like sparks into dry grass. His quatrains spread from hand to hand, copied, whispered, and guarded as if they were sacred scripture. But what made his words endure? Many before him had claimed visions. Many had written prophecies. Yet their names faded, their books forgotten. Nostradamus endures. His verses live not because they are clear, but because they are unclear. They are open doors, inviting every generation to walk through and see themselves inside. A line written in the 1500s might seem to describe a king's death in 1559, or a dictator's rise in 1939, or even an attack in 2001. The ambiguity is a genius. His poetry becomes a mirror, reflecting not just the future but the fears of whoever dares to read it. Picture this: a mother in plague-stricken France, clutching one of his verses by candlelight, reading of great pestilence and believing it was a village's doom. A soldier in Napoleon's army, convinced he was living through the foretold rise of the Antichrist. A family in the 20th century, staring at news of the Second World War, trembling at quatrains about rivers of blood and tyrants born in the West. The same words, across centuries, carrying new meanings like a curse that never dies. Even today, Nostradamus haunts us. When tragedy strikes or chaos looms, his name resurfaces like a ghost from history. His words flood social media. His prophecies are dissected in television specials. His name whispered in panic. And so, we must ask ourselves, how is it possible that a man who lived and died 500 years ago can still command our attention, still send chills down our spine? What power lies within those cryptic lines, and what secret knowledge did he claim to see? In that candlelit chamber, Nostradamus pauses. His hand lingers over the parchment. Perhaps he wonders if anyone will ever understand. Perhaps he fears that his visions will outlive him and shape the world beyond his control. He lays down his quill. The candles flicker lower. Outside, night presses against the window. Inside, on the table, lies a small collection of verses that will one day ignite centuries of obsession. And this is where our journey begins. Not with certainty, but with mystery. Not with answers, but with questions. Who was Nostradamus? Truly? Did he see the future, or did he merely hold a mirror to humanity's deepest fears? And most of all, which of his prophecies are yet to come true? The shadow of a prophecy stretches long, and its darkness is not faded. It waits, patient, lingering, whispering across time. And now, we step into it. Michel de Nostradamus was not born a prophet. He was born a child in a small French town, the kind of boy who ran through narrow stone streets and listened to church bells echo across tiled roofs. He entered the world in December of 1503 in Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, a land of sun, olive groves, and vineyards. But though his birthplace was peaceful, his bloodline carried shadows. His family came from Jewish roots, though they had converted to Catholicism generations before. This was not merely a matter of faith, it was survival. In a France suspicious of outsiders, Jews often faced persecution, expulsion, or worse. To thrive, they had to adapt, to hide in plain sight. And so, Michel grew up with a dual identity, outwardly Catholic, inwardly connected to a heritage of wisdom, mysticism, and survival. From an early age, young Michel showed unusual brilliance. His grandfather, who had studied astrology and ancient texts, whispered teachings into his ears. The boy was fascinated by the stars, by cycles of the heavens, by patterns invisible to others. He was not content with simple lessons. He devoured knowledge. When others saw the sky as decoration, he saw a map. When others read scripture as unquestioned truth, he wondered about the layers beneath. His curiosity became his gift, but also his danger. As he grew older, Michel left home to pursue formal studies. He entered the University of Avignon at the tender age of 14, a child among men. There, he immersed himself in Latin, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy. But fate intervened swiftly. The plague struck, sweeping through the city like a shadow with claws. Schools closed, professors fled, students scattered. Death was no longer an abstract lesson. It was everywhere, gnawing at the edges of life. Michel was forced to leave, his education interrupted by the cool hand of destiny. Yet the plague also planted seeds in his heart. It showed him the fragility of human existence, the thin line between prosperity and despair. That awareness would never leave him. Years later, Michel returned to academia, this time at Montpellier, one of Europe's most prestigious medical schools. There he became a physician, learning the secrets of the body, the balances of humors, and the treatments of his time. His talent was undeniable. Patients trusted him. Colleagues admired him. He was skilled in herbal remedies and practical cures when so many doctors relied on superstition. He saved lives during outbreaks of plague when others dared not approach the sick. His reputation as a healer spread. And yet, medicine was not enough. Nostradamus had seen too much suffering, too many corpses carried out of homes, too many cries echoing through empty streets. Disease had already claimed his wife and children in one of the early outbreaks, shattering his heart. For a man who devoted himself to healing, the inability to save his own family was unbearable. He turned inward. He began to search not only for cures of the body, but for understanding of destiny itself. If medicine could not hold back death, perhaps knowledge of the future could prepare him for what was to come. It was in these years that Michel began drifting toward what would later make him famous. He still practiced as a physician, still mixed herbs and studied the stars, but he also began experimenting with ways of seeing beyond the ordinary. He spent nights with astrological charts, trying to align human fates with celestial movements. He read obscure texts, occult works, classical prophecies, and hidden manuscripts. He became a man caught between worlds, half scientist, half mystic. Friends and neighbors noticed his eccentricities. He would disappear for hours into libraries or climb towers to watch the stars. At times, he would fall into strange trances, scribbling notes and muttering verses as if some unseen hand guided him. In a world where heresy was punished by fire, such behavior was dangerous. But Nostradamus was cautious. He cloaked his curiosity beneath the respectable title of doctor. Behind the mask of healer, the prophet was quietly being born. Michel de Nostradamus became Nostradamus not through sudden inspiration, but through layers of suffering and survival. His Jewish heritage taught him to hide truths beneath symbols. His medical training showed him the limits of science. His personal tragedies burned into him the awareness of fate's cruelty. And his obsession with the stars gave him a framework for seeing the world not as random, but as cyclical, patterned, inevitable. The making of a seer was not the work of one night or one vision. It was the work of a lifetime forged in the fires of loss, sharpened by intellect, and veiled in mystery. Nostradamus did not set out to become a prophet. He became one because the world demanded it of him. People hungered for answers, for certainty in a time of chaos. And perhaps, deep down, so did he. By the time he began to write his prophecies, he was already a man transformed. No longer just a physician, no longer simply a scholar. He had become something else, something that frightened the powerful and fascinated the masses. He was a man straddling two worlds, one rooted in flesh and blood, the other in visions and riddles. And so, the boy from St. Remy, the young man who studied medicine, the widower who lost everything, became Nostradamus, the man whose words would outlive empires. But before his verses shook kings and terrified peasants, he first had to face the most dangerous challenge of all, how to speak the truth in a world that would burn him for uttering it. This is where the story turns. For Michel de Nostradamus was about to step into the storm, caught between science and sorcery, reason and revelation. The making of a seer was complete. The writing of the prophet was about to begin. The Renaissance was a strange age, suspended between the old world of superstition and the dawning light of reason. In the cities of Europe, great minds debated philosophy, rediscovered ancient texts, and pushed the boundaries of science. Yet, in the same streets, people still whispered about witches, feared the evil eye, and looked to omens in the flight of birds. It was an age of contradictions, where a man could be both a physician and a mystic, a scholar and an accused heretic. Nostradamus lived at the very heart of this tension. As a physician, he was respected, even admired. His cures for plague and other illnesses seemed to work where traditional methods failed. He emphasized cleanliness, fresh air, and herbal remedies at a time when many doctors clung to bloodletting and charms. His knowledge was practical, rooted in observation, and it saved countless lives. To the sick, he was a beacon of hope. To other doctors, he was sometimes a rival, envied for his success and distrusted for his unorthodox methods. But Nostradamus was never content to remain within the narrow lanes of accepted medicine. He gazed at the heavens as well as the human body. Astrology fascinated him, not the fortune-telling of charlatans, but the complex mathematical alignments of planets and stars. He believed the heavens influenced the fates of men, shaping events on Earth with cosmic rhythms. To him, a physician who ignored the stars was like a sailor ignoring the sky at sea. And so, in his mind, medicine and astrology were not opposites. They were companions. Yet others did not see it that way. To the church, astrology was dangerous, flirting with heresy. To skeptics, it was nonsense. To common folk, it was sorcery. Nostradamus walked a perilous path, balancing on the thin line between scholar and sorcerer. His enemies were quick to whisper accusations. Some claimed he conjured spirits to aid his visions. Others believed he had made a pact with dark forces. A few even feared he was the Antichrist himself, hiding behind a doctor's robe. He knew these suspicions well. That is why he cloaked his writings in riddles, why he used cryptic language, obscure symbols, and tangled phrasing. To write plainly was to risk condemnation. To write in riddles was to survive. His prophecies could be read as poetry, or as code, or as nonsense, depending on the eye of the beholder. But to those willing to believe, there were glimpses of the future. Behind closed doors, Nostradamus performed rituals that blended the scientific with the mystical. He would meditate before bowls of water and brass tripods, staring into reflections until visions came to him. He practiced a form of scrying, an ancient technique of gazing into water, fire, or mirrors to summon images. Some said he fasted for days, purifying his body to open his mind. Others believe he inhaled vapors from herbs and incense, allowing him to drift into altered states. Were these visions products of imagination, or windows into something beyond the ordinary? To his followers, they were revelations. To his critics, they were proof of sorcery. This duality defined him. On one hand, Nostradamus was a man of the Renaissance, reading Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy. On the other, he seemed a relic of an older world, steeped in arcane practices, channeling visions like an oracle of antiquity. He belonged to both worlds and to neither, and that is why he remains so mysterious even today. His life was not without danger. The Inquisition still hunted those accused of heresy. Books could be banned, men imprisoned, reputations destroyed. Nostradamus knew that his curiosity could cost him daily. More than once, he was accused of practicing forbidden arts. More than once, he faced hostility from the church. But he was clever. He learned to present himself as a loyal Catholic, as a physician above suspicion. The riddles in his writings were not only poetic flourishes. They were shields designed to hide him from those who might seek his ruin. In this way, Nostradamus survived where others fell. Many mystics of his era were silenced, their works burned, their names erased. He endured because he adapted. He wore the cloak of science while whispering the language of sorcery. He healed the body while hinting at secrets of the soul. He gave people enough hope to trust him, enough mystery to fear him, and enough ambiguity to protect himself from open attack. The question remains, what did Nostradamus truly believe? Was he convinced of his visions, or was he a clever man who saw the power of prophecy in a fearful age? The truth may lie somewhere in between. Perhaps he believed, as many of his time did, that the world was layered with hidden meanings, that God had written his design not only in Scripture but in the stars, in the elements, and in the future itself. To decode that design was not to defy God, but to glimpse his plan. And yet, in the candlelight, as Nostradamus scribbled verse after verse, there must have been moments when even he was unsure. Were these words truly divine visions, or were they the fevered dreams of a man haunted by plague, war, and personal grief? Did he see the future, or did he only see the reflection of his own troubled times, dressed in symbols and shadows? Between science and sorcery, Nostradamus carved his place in history. He was never fully one or the other. He was both, and that is why he endures. His quatrains carry the authority of a scholar and the mystery of a seer. They bridge reason and faith, knowledge and fear. And though centuries have passed, they still provoke the same question that once troubled his contemporaries. Was he a doctor of men or a prophet of destiny? The answer may never be clear, but it is in that uncertainty between the rational and the mystical that the power of Nostradamus resides. He was not simply a man of his time. He was a man caught between worlds. And it was in this in-between space, half science, half sorcery, that his most famous work was born, the verses that would echo through centuries, wrapped in mystery, daring to speak of things yet to come. The year was 1555. After years of silence, study, and guarded whispers, Nostradamus stepped fully into the role that would define him for centuries. That year, in Lyon, the first edition of Les Prophéties appeared, a slim, unassuming book, bound in leather, filled with cryptic verses arranged in quatrains. Just 4 lines each, written in a mixture of French, Latin, Greek, and even Occitan. To the casual reader, they looked like riddles, almost nonsensical poems. But to those who hungered for signs of destiny, they were lightning captured on a page. The words were not straightforward predictions. They were veiled, cloaked in symbols, tangled in metaphors. A reader might encounter a line about lions clashing in combat, another about rivers running red with blood, another about fire falling from the heavens. To one person, it spoke of plague, to another, of war, to a third, of some cosmic punishment yet to come. Nostradamus had crafted his quatrains like puzzles without single answers, and that was the brilliance of it. In their ambiguity, they could live forever. Why did he write them this way? The reasons were both practical and philosophical. Practically, he lived in a dangerous time. The Catholic Church was deeply suspicious of prophecy. Anything that smelled of sorcery or heresy could be grounds for investigation, even execution. To speak plainly of the future was to risk being branded a witch, a heretic, or worse. Nostradamus was no fool. By writing in riddles, he created a shield for himself. His quatrains could be read as poetry, allegory, or scripture-inspired reflections, depending on who was reading them. Philosophically, Nostradamus seemed to believe that truth itself was never simple. The future was not a straight road but a labyrinth. To speak of it directly was impossible. Only fragments could be glimpsed, like reflections in water. By writing in riddles, he was not hiding the truth. He was reflecting the way truth appeared to him. Hazy, broken, incomplete, yet powerful. The first edition of Les Prophecies contained just over 350 quatrains. Later editions would expand the collection to nearly 1,000. Each verse was numbered and grouped into centuries, not referring to time but to sets of 100. The numbering gave the book a sense of structure, almost like chapters of an ancient scripture. Readers began poring over them, matching verses to recent events, searching for signs of their own fates. Imagine the world into which this book was released. France trembling under the shadow of plague, religious tensions between Catholics and Protestants boiling toward civil war, and the common people searching desperately for answers. To hold Nostradamus's book was to feel, if only for a moment, that the future was not entirely unknowable, that in the chaos of life there might be a pattern, however hidden. But there was also fear. Some believed the book itself was dangerous, that its words carried curses, that to read too closely was to invite doom. Others dismissed it as nonsense, the ramblings of a deluded man. And yet, the book sold. It spread beyond France, translated and copied, whispered about in courts and taverns alike. Nostradamus, once a provincial doctor, had suddenly become something much more, a prophet of Europe. The verses themselves are haunting. In one, he writes of the young lion overcoming the old one in combat, later tied to the death of King Henry II. In another, he described a great fire appearing in the sky at 45 degrees, interpreted centuries later as an omen of bombings and burning cities. Again and again, his words seemed to take on new life as history unfolded. What gave the quatrains their power was not just their content, but their style. Nostradamus wrote with a voice that was both ancient and eternal. His language was stark, almost brutal at times, yet woven with poetic imagery that suggested forces beyond human control. Blood, fire, floods, and tyrants filled his lines, giving the sense that human history was not progress but repetition, an endless cycle of rise and fall, of glory and ruin. Some believe he was guided by divine inspiration, a prophet chosen by God. Others suspected he drew from occult sources, peering into forbidden knowledge. And still others thought him a clever manipulator, crafting verses vague enough to fit any future. The truth may be all three, or none, but what cannot be denied is the impact. With Les Prophecies, Nostradamus set into motion a phenomenon that would outlive him by centuries. The man himself remained cautious. He knew the danger of what he had released. His quatrains were wrapped not only in symbolism but also in deliberate obscurity. Sometimes he altered names into anagrams. Sometimes he mixed languages in a single line. Sometimes he buried astrological codes only scholars could decode. To the untrained reader, it was poetry. To the initiated, it was prophecy. To his enemies, it was camouflage. As the first copies circulated, whispers grew. Some called him a genius. Some called him a fraud. Some feared he had seen too much. But all agreed on one thing. His book was unlike anything else in Europe. No priest, no scholar, no poet had ever written something quite like it. It was as if Nostradamus had captured the essence of an age's anxiety and distilled it into verse. The prophecies had begun. The candlelight scribbles of provincial doctor were now in the hands of kings and commoners alike. And though many dismissed them, enough believed to keep the fire alive. The quatrains would spread, their meanings shifting and reshaping with each new century. Nostradamus himself could not have imagined how far his words would travel, or how deeply they would sink into the human imagination. But the question lingered. Did he truly foresee the future, or had he simply given the world a mirror in which it would always find its fears reflected? That question, unanswered then, still haunts us now. And soon, history itself would give his words their first great test, a prediction tied to the fate of a king, and a death so shocking that Europe would never forget it. The summer sun of 1559 shone brightly over Paris, and the city buzzed with celebration. France was alive with pageantry, music, and the ringing of church bells. The royal court was gathered for a moment of triumph. The marriage of King Henry II's daughter, Elizabeth of Valois, to Philip II of Spain. It was a union meant to secure peace between two great powers, a rare moment of unity in a Europe divided by religion and war. The people poured into the streets, waving banners, cheering, and drinking in the festivities. But beneath the joy, a shadow lingered, a shadow cast years earlier by the cryptic pen of Nostradamus. One quatrain, in particular, whispered through court circles like a curse. The young lion will overcome the old on the field of war in single combat. He will pierce his eyes through a golden cage, 2 wounds won, then he dies a cruel death. Those who had read the verse shivered. They saw in it an omen for their king, a man known for his love of jousting and knightly combat. Henry II was no longer young. He was in his 40s, though still strong and vigorous. His emblem, emblazoned on his armor, was the lion. His eyes, set deep beneath his gilded helmet, glinted like stars through the narrow visor. It was hard not to see the lions as a direct threat to him. But Henry, proud and headstrong, brushed aside such fears. He loved the sport too much, and to withdraw would have seemed like cowardice. The celebrations carried on for days, a festival of power and wealth. Nobles in glittering armor paraded their skill on horseback, lances lowered, the thunder of hoofs echoing through the lists. The king himself, though urged to caution, insisted on joining the jousts. He had always been a warrior king, a man who thrived on competition, and he would not let superstition dictate his actions. His queen, Catherine de' Medici, pleaded with him to reconsider, but Henry refused. The lists had been prepared, the crowds awaited, and the king would not disappoint. Then came the fateful duel. On June 30th, King Henry II faced Gabriel Montgomery, the captain of his Scottish Guard, a tall and formidable knight nearly 20 years his junior. To the crowd, it was a perfect match. The seasoned king against the younger challenger, the old lion against the young. Few could have missed the uncanny echo of Nostradamus's verse. The first passes were clean, the lances shattering in bursts of splinters. The crowd roared with approval. Henry, flushed with triumph, demanded another round. Against Montgomery's hesitation and the warnings of his courtiers, the king insisted it would be the last pass. As the two riders thundered toward one another, something went terribly wrong. Montgomery's lance struck Henry's visor with deadly precision. A jagged splinter broke off and forced its way through the narrow eye slit, the golden cage of the helmet. It pierced the king's eye, driving deep into his brain. Henry fell from his horse, writhing in agony. Gasps and cries of horror rippled through the crowd as nobles rushed to his side. The celebration dissolved into chaos. The king was carried away, blood streaming from his wound, his body convulsing. For 10 days, he lingered in excruciating pain, his physicians powerless to save him. The court, once filled with laughter and music, turned into a chamber of dread, each day a cruel vigil. Catherine de' Medici, who had long relied on Nostradamus for guidance, saw the prophecy fulfilled before her eyes. She kept watch by her husband's bed as his strength drained away. On July 10th, 1559, Henry II of France died, leaving his kingdom shaken, his prophecy-sealed fate carved into history. The death was not only a personal tragedy but a political earthquake. France plunged into instability. His young son, Francis II, ascended the throne, but he was frail and inexperienced. Catherine de' Medici, thrust into the role of regent, would now wield power in a nation on the brink of civil war. Religious tensions between Catholics and Huguenots would erupt into decades of bloodshed, the wars of religion that scarred France for a generation. And at the center of it all, whispers of Nostradamus grew louder. The quatrain about the lions was recited again and again, copied, shared, and remembered. To many, it was undeniable. Nostradamus had foreseen the death of their king. The accuracy seemed too perfect, too chilling. The young lion was Montgomery, the old lion was Henry, the golden cage his helmet, the 2 wounds won the piercing splinter that destroyed his iron brain. It fit like a lock to a key. This was the moment that transformed Nostradamus from a curious astrologer and physician into a prophet of terrifying renown. If one prophecy had come true so precisely, then surely others would as well. His quatrains, once obscure verses, now seemed to hold the keys to the fate of nations. Kings and queens turned to his writings, desperate for guidance. Common folk repeated his words like prayers, or curses. And the legend of Nostradamus began to spread far beyond France, carried by the echo of a king's death. But was it truly prophecy or an uncanny coincidence? Skeptics argued that Nostradamus' words were vague enough to fit many events. After all, jousts were dangerous. Kings had died in them before. Helmets had visors. Accidents happened. Perhaps it was not foresight but probability. Yet the timing, the imagery, the exactness, it was too much for many to dismiss. In the years that followed, believers clung to Nostradamus' book as if it was scripture. Each new tragedy, each new war, was seen through the lens of his quatrains. The prophecy of Henry's death became the cornerstone of his reputation, proof that the doctor from Provence was no mere poet but a man touched by visions of destiny. Henry II's death was more than a king's tragedy. It was a turning point in the story of prophecy itself. For with his fall, the age of Nostradamus truly began. The halls of the French court had grown darker after the death of Henry II. What had been a place of splendor and celebration now carried an air of dread. The widowed queen, Catherine de' Medici, emerged from the shadows with a new kind of power. She was no longer just a consort of a king. She was a regent, the guardian of her fragile sons, and the de facto ruler of a fractured realm. France teetered on the edge of civil war, its nobles divided by religious loyalties, its people restless, and its throne perilously unstable. Catherine was no ordinary queen. Born into the infamous Medici family of Florence, she had grown up surrounded by whispers of power, plots, and poison. She understood survival better than most. Her marriage to Henry had once made her seem insignificant beside him, but now, with her sons too young and too weak to rule, she had become the spider at the center of the web. Every decision she made could determine the fate of France. It was in this perilous atmosphere that Nostradamus became more than a curiosity. He became her secret weapon. Catherine had long shown an interest in astrology, omens, and prophecy. Her Italian blood carried with it a fascination for the occult, and in Nostradamus she found a man who seemed to see further than the rest, a man whose verses had already etched themselves into royal history. His prediction of Henry's death was not just remembered, it was feared. Catherine, pragmatic and shrewd, decided that such a gift could not be ignored. Nostradamus was summoned to court, his reputation preceding him. He arrived not as a nobleman but as a physician, an astrologer, and a writer whose cryptic words carried the weight of destiny. To the courtiers, he seemed an odd figure, reserved, enigmatic, his gaze heavy with thought. But to Catherine, he was a man who could provide something no soldier or minister could, glimpses of the unseen forces shaping the kingdom's future. The queen kept Nostradamus close, consulting him not only on matters of astrology but on the lives of her children. Catherine's greatest fear was the fragility of her dynasty. Her sons, Francis II, Charles IX, and Henry III, were weak and frail, their health uncertain, their futures precarious. Could they rule? Would they survive? Nostradamus' answers gave her both hope and dread. He spoke of greatness, but also of short reigns, of wars, and of blood. Rumors spread quickly through the palace. Servants whispered that the queen's chambers were lit with candles late into the night, her astrologers drawing up charts, her prophets reading stars. Some accused her of witchcraft, others of consorting with demons. Yet none could deny her determination. Catherine believed that survival required every tool, diplomacy, force, and prophecy alike. And if Nostradamus' words could give her an advantage, she would use them. But Catherine's fascination went beyond mere politics. There was something deeply personal in her reliance on Nostradamus. She saw in him a mirror of her own precarious position. He, too, was a man both admired and reviled, a figure whose life was shaped by suspicion and faith. The two understood each other in a way that few in the court could. While her enemies plotted in shadows, she turned to Nostradamus for clarity, for reassurance, for the faint promise that destiny was still within her grasp. At the same time, Nostradamus himself walked a dangerous line. His words could elevate him, but they could also condemn him. To be too specific risked angering the powerful. To be too vague risked being dismissed as a fraud. He couched his verses in riddles, symbols, and metaphors, knowing they would outlast him, open to endless interpretation. Catherine valued this ambiguity. It gave her the freedom to shape his prophecies into weapons. When needed, she could present his words as validation of her rule, or as warnings to her rivals. The court of France, already a place of intrigue, became even more entangled with superstition. Nobles eyed each other warily, fearful that Nostradamus might have whispered their fate to the queen. Foreign ambassadors carried tales back to their masters that Catherine kept a prophet at her side, that she was guided not by ministers but by visions. It added to her mystique and to her menace. Still, the world beyond the palace walls was unraveling. Protestant Huguenots and Catholic loyalists sharpened their swords, and bloodshed loomed. Nostradamus' writings seemed to hint at these conflicts: brothers at war, rivers of blood, fire in the cities. Catherine, desperate to maintain her children's throne, leaned on these warnings as justification for her often ruthless decisions. If the stars foretold doom, then she must do whatever it took to stave it off, even if it meant betrayal, massacre, or manipulation. Yet, for all her pragmatism, Catherine remained haunted. The death of her husband had been foretold with chilling precision, and now she feared the same fate awaited her sons. Could Nostradamus truly see their futures? Was their dynasty doomed before it had even begun? In the quiet moments of the night, perhaps she wondered whether she was ruling a kingdom or merely playing out the final act of a story already written. For Nostradamus, his time at Catherine's side solidified his place in history. No longer was he simply a provincial doctor from Provence. He was now the confidant of the most powerful women in France. His reputation grew, his quatrains circulated more widely, and his legacy began to harden into myth. He became not just a prophet of doom, but a figure woven into the very fabric of European power. And yet, the question lingered in every whisper, every shadow, every prophecy. Was he truly foretelling the future, or was Catherine shaping destiny to match his words? The Queen's embrace of Nostradamus blurred the line between prediction and manipulation, between fate and will. One thing was certain. In Catherine de' Medici, Nostradamus had found his greatest patron, and in Nostradamus, Catherine had found her most mysterious ally. Together, they stood at the crossroads of history, their fates bound by blood, prophecy, and the fragile crown of France. In the quiet town of Salon-de-Provence, where the Mistral winds carried whispers through narrow stone streets, Nostradamus worked late into the night. His desk was cluttered with parchment, quills, astrological charts, and a single flickering lamp that painted shadows across the walls. Here, away from the noise of the court, he composed what would become his most enduring and most feared legacy, Les Prophéties. To the outside world, it was a book of strange verses, but to those who dared read between the lines, it seemed nothing less than a window into destiny. When the first edition was published in 1555, it contained just 100 quatrains, 4-line verses written in an arcane, poetic French. But as the years passed, Nostradamus added more until the collection swelled to nearly 1,000. He called them centuries, each book holding 100 quatrains, though not all were complete. The name suggested not just a numerical division, but an audacious scope, a vision that stretched across centuries, perhaps even to the end of time. What made the book so compelling was its ambiguity. Nostradamus never gave precise dates, never named his figures directly. Instead, he cloaked them in riddles, metaphors, and strange imagery: lions and eagles, rivers of blood, fire from the heavens, and kings undone by fate. To some, this was a mark of a fraud, deliberate vagueness that allowed anyone to interpret the lines to fit any event. But to others, this was the essence of prophecy itself, truth hidden in shadow, waiting for the right moment to reveal its meaning. The structure of the quatrain seemed carefully chosen. Written in a mix of French, Latin, Greek, and even Occitan, they were resistant to easy understanding. Nostradamus often twisted grammar or used archaic words that baffled even learned readers. Some suspected he was deliberately encrypting his verses, concealing them from those who might accuse him of heresy or witchcraft. Others believed the obfuscation was mystical, as though the words themselves were encoded by divine inspiration, designed to yield their secrets only when history caught up to them. What truly unsettled readers was how often the verses seemed to align with real events. A king struck down in a joust, fires consuming great cities, bloodshed between brothers. As more tragedies unfolded in France and beyond, the pages of Les Prophéties began to look less like poetry and more like a mirror reflecting the fate of nations. The book spread like wildfire. Nobles and scholars clamored for copies, while common folk whispered its verses in taverns and markets. Some saw it as a warning, others as a curse. Wherever it went, it inspired both awe and dread. By the time of Catherine de' Medici's regency, the book had already become a weapon in the arsenal of politics. Passages were cited to justify decisions, to warn of enemies, to remind the people that destiny favored the queen's hand. But beneath the political use lay something deeper, the sense that the book was more than prophecy. Many began to treat it as a kind of coded scripture, a mystical book of shadows that hinted at knowledge forbidden to ordinary men. Hidden within its lines were suggestions of astronomy, numerology, and ancient wisdom. Some claimed Nostradamus drew on the secrets of the Kabbalah, others on the teachings of the Sibyls or the arcane traditions of the East. Each theory only added to the book's mystique. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Scholars argued that Nostradamus had written in riddles precisely so that he could never be proven wrong. They accused him of weaving generalities into poetic form, leaving the human imagination to do the rest. But even skeptics could not deny the uncanny resonance of certain quatrains. The death of Henry II had already sealed Nostradamus's reputation. With every new war or catastrophe, more verses seemed to find their fulfillment. For Catherine, the book was both a guide and a shield. She kept copies close at hand, often consulting them in times of crisis. Her enemies whispered that she ruled France by prophecy, that her policies were shaped not by reason but by the riddles of a Provençal mystic. And yet, this rumor gave her an aura of inevitability. Who would dare challenge a queen who seemed to hold destiny itself in her grasp? The public fascination with the prophecies only grew after Nostradamus' death in 1566. Without the man to explain or defend his verses, the book took on a life of its own. Each new generation looked into it and found their own fears reflected back. Plague, famine, invasion, war. It was a mirror not just of the future but of the human mind, ever ready to seek patterns in chaos, to find meaning in uncertainty. Even today, the book is read with the same mixture of fear and wonder. Wars, assassinations, revolutions, each has been tied, sometimes tenuously, to Nostradamus' quatrains. His words survive precisely because they are both specific and vague, haunting in their imagery but elusive in their meaning. They remain, like shadows on the wall, always shifting, never fully clear. The Book of Shadows, as it might be called, was more than Nostradamus' masterpiece. It was his trap. It bound his name to history not as a man of medicine or science, but as a prophet whose words could never die. As long as humanity fears the future, his verses will be read, studied, and feared. And that is perhaps his greatest prophecy of all, that the hunger for destiny, for answers, would never leave us. The question, however, lingers in every reader's mind. Did Nostradamus truly see the centuries ahead, or did he simply understand human nature so well that he could anticipate the endless cycles of war, power, and tragedy? Was his book a divine vision, or a clever mirror held up to mankind? Whatever the answer, the world could not turn away. With every page turned, with every quatrain whispered, the mystery deepened. And Catherine de Medici, with her reliance on this strange prophet, ensured that the Book of Shadows would be forever bound to the destiny of kings. Long before he was whispered about as a prophet, Nostradamus was known by a different name, the doctor who walked among the dying. In the early 16th century, the plague stalked Europe like a phantom, striking towns with terrifying speed, leaving behind streets filled with silence and death. Nostradamus, trained in medicine and steeped in the science of his age, did not run from it. He walked straight into its burning heart. The Black Death had never truly left Europe since its first great outbreak in the 14th century. By the time Nostradamus began practicing, outbreaks were a recurring horror, descending without warning, carried by fleas, rats, and the currents of human trade. Families were torn apart in days, villages abandoned, entire regions scarred. For many, the plague was not just a disease but a divine punishment, a fire of judgment burning across a continent. Nostradamus approached it differently. Instead of bloodletting and the superstitions common among physicians of his time, he turned to practical methods: hygiene, fresh air, clean water. He encouraged the burning of contaminated clothing, the cleansing of streets, and the use of herbal remedies. Most radical of all, he advised patients to avoid bleeding altogether, a practice he considered harmful rather than healing. To some, his advice seemed heretical, but his results often spoke louder than tradition. Stories spread of the doctor who dared treat plague victims when others fled. He would ride into infected towns armed only with his remedies, his wits, and an iron will. Many patients survived under his care, and where Nostradamus passed, hope seemed to follow. Though he could not stop the plague entirely, his reputation grew. People began to see him not just as a physician, but as a man touched by some deeper knowledge. It is here that medicine and prophecy began to blur. For when Nostradamus later wrote his quatrains, the imagery of plague and fire filled his verses. He described cities consumed by flames, pestilence spreading like shadows, corpses filling the streets. To his readers, these were more than poetic images. They were lived memories of a nightmare they knew too well. Each line seemed to echo their own fears, their own experiences, their own dread of what might return. From the sky will come a great king of terror, one verse warned, bringing back to life the great king of the Mongols before and after Mars reigned happily. To some, this spoke of invasion, but to others it recalled the unseen terror of disease descending like a phantom from the heavens. Other quatrains told of blood in the streets, fire from the heavens, death in the cities, images that resonated deeply with a Europe scarred by plague and fire alike. The link between fire and pestilence was not accidental. In times of outbreak, entire district was sometimes burned to halt the spread of disease. Nostradamus himself had recommended the burning of infected belongings. Fire became both destroyer and purifier, a symbol of suffering but also of survival. His verses, steeped in this duality, seemed to capture the paradox of plague, a disaster that consumed lives, yet forced humanity to rebuild anew. But it was not only physical disease that Nostradamus spoke of, it was a spiritual plague of fear. In a world where death struck without warning, where neighbors could become corpses in a day, prophecy itself became a balm and a weapon. People turned to Nostradamus not just as a doctor but as a seer, hoping he could reveal when the next outbreak would strike or whether they might escape its grasp. His reputation as a healer gave weight to his reputation as a prophet. After all, if he could fight the plague, why not fate itself? Catherine de Medici, too, saw in his medical past a symbol of resilience. Just as he had braved the plague to save lives, perhaps he could guide her through plague of civil war that now consumed France. To her, his verses about fire and pestilence were not abstractions but warnings, omens that must be heeded if a dynasty was to survive. Yet, as always, skeptics found another interpretation. Perhaps Nostradamus's verses did not foretell disasters at all, but merely echoed the horrors he had already seen. Was he truly predicting the future, or simply painting the past in ominous strokes? If so, then the power of his prophecy lay not in its accuracy but in its universality. Any age could see its own suffering reflected in his words. The imagery of fire and plague would follow Nostradamus's reputation across centuries. Later readers claimed he had predicted the Great Fire of London in 1666, when flames consumed the city and plague returned in its wake. Others said his word foreshadowed outbreaks far beyond Europe, even into modern times. The details mattered less than the resonance, humanity's eternal fear of being consumed, whether by fire, pestilence, or fate itself. In the end, Nostradamus's dual identity as healer and prophet fused into something larger. He was not just a doctor of bodies or a doctor of destiny. He was both. The man who had once prescribed rose petals and clean air against the plague now prescribed riddles against the terror of tomorrow. His legacy was built not only on survival but on the shadows of disaster, fire and plague entwined in verse that promised both fear and meaning. And it was this blending of medicine and mystery that ensured his words would live on. For as long as humanity faced disease and disaster, as long as the fire plague threatened to consume us, Nostradamus's verses would be there. Reminders of the line between prophecy and memory, between fear and fate, is as thin as smoke in the air. The 16th century was not an age of peace. It was an age of upheaval. Across Europe, the old certainties were unraveling. The Reformation had shattered the unity of Christendom, pitting Catholic against Protestant, brother against brother. Monarchs waged endless wars for territory and faith, while ordinary people bore the crushing weight of famine, taxation, and fear. It was a time when kingdoms rose and fell like tides, and the shadow of apocalypse seemed to hover over every horizon. France, the land of Nostradamus, was itself a powder keg waiting to ignite. The wars of religion were simmering, tensions between Catholic loyalists and Protestant Huguenots threatening to tear the nation apart. The death of Henry II had left the Valois dynasty vulnerable, ruled by child kings under the iron hand of Catherine de Medici. Every decision she made, every alliance she forged, could tip the balance toward civil war or toward survival. Beyond France, the turmoil spread like ripples in water. In England, Elizabeth I had taken the throne, steering her realm through a treacherous dance of faith and politics. Spain, under Philip II, sought to be the champion of Catholic Europe, amassing wealth from the New World even as it clashed with Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. The Ottoman Empire pressed at the eastern borders, its power stretching deep into Europe. The Holy Roman Empire, fractured and restless, was locked in its own internal struggles. It was a world where the map of power was constantly being redrawn, and prophecy found fertile soil. For when kings fell, when cities burned, when plague struck, people looked for patterns, for signs that history was more than chaos, that it followed some hidden script. Nostradamus's quatrains, vague yet vivid, seemed to provide exactly that. They did not merely describe events. They gave them meaning, framing each catastrophe as part of a larger destiny. One quatrain spoke of blood in the streets by sword and fire, cries of the dying echoing through the night. To those living in France, this was no abstract vision. It was the world they inhabited. Massacres, riots, and assassinations were daily threats. In Germany, too, warlords and princes fought in the name of faith, leaving fields littered with corpses. To the fearful, Nostradamus seemed less like a poet and more like a prophet whose words echoed across borders. And then there were the great rumors of apocalypse. The year 1588 would later be tied to the Armada, but decade before, readers already found in Nostradamus predictions of a great naval disaster. Some looked to his verses and claimed he foresaw the fall of Spain's mighty fleet. Others insisted he had predicted the rise of Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, as a great ruler who would defy her enemies. Everywhere, rulers began to fear and respect the shadow cast by the Provençal sea. Was it mere coincidence, or were they truly players on a stage that Nostradamus had already described? Catherine de' Medici, always attuned to power, used his reputation as both shield and sword. When she faced rebellion, she could point to quatrains that justified her ruthlessness as destiny. When her enemies whispered of a downfall, she turned to Nostradamus's words for reassurance that her son still had a role to play in history. But the deeper truth was this: Europe itself was in search of prophecy. The continent was battered, uncertain of its future, and in every crisis, people reached for meaning. Nostradamus did not create the chaos. He gave it language. His quatrains became a prism through which kings, queens, and commoners could interpret their suffering. Whether he foresaw the future or merely reflected the present mattered less than the comfort or terror his words inspired. At the same time, skeptics pointed to another possibility. Nostradamus was not so much predicting the future as capturing the eternal cycle of human conflict. After all, had there ever been a century without war, plague, or fire? Had there ever been a time when kings did not fall or cities did not burn? His brilliance, they argued, was not supernatural foresight but an understanding of the unchanging patterns of human history. Yet, the effect was undeniable. In a Europe racked by bloodshed, Nostradamus's verses became scripture for some and blasphemy for others. They circulated in secret, read by candlelight, smuggled across borders, recited in hushed voices in taverns. Some sought comfort in them, others sought advantage, but none could ignore them. As the wars of the 16th century deepened, Nostradamus's legend only grew stronger. His name became synonymous with fate itself, a man whose writings seemed to chart the course of kings and empires. And so, while armies clashed and kingdoms faltered, his word endured, carried on the winds of turmoil, haunting Europe with the promise, or the threat, that destiny had already been written. This was a crucible in which the myth of Nostradamus was forged, not in peace, but in chaos. A world on fire gave birth to a prophet whose verses seemed to speak to all and promise nothing, a mirror in which every age could see its own reflection. In the candle-lit halls of the French court, shadows flickered across gilt ceilings as whispers of prophecy mingled with the scent of incense and fay. The Valois dynasty, fragile and beset by enemies on every side, turned not only to diplomats and generals but to a man who claimed to read the stars. Nostradamus, once a wandering physician, now found himself at the very heart of power, as a trusted astrologer of Catherine de' Medici, queen consort of Henry II and regent to her sons. For Catherine, prophecy was more than curiosity. It was a weapon. She had grown up amid the rivalries of the Medici clan, in a world where survival meant mastering intrigue. When she married into the French royal family, she carried with her not only the cunning of Florence, but also a deep belief in the guidance of astrologers. So when Nostradamus' writings began to circulate, when whispers told of a man whose quatrains seemed to echo with divine foresight, she summoned him. Their first meeting, legend says, was filled with tension. Catherine had heard that Nostradamus had written of the king's death in a most peculiar and gruesome way. One quatrain spoke of a young lion who would pierce the old lion's eye in combat. At first, it seemed nonsense, until Henry II jousted against Gabriel de Montgomery in 1559. The lance broke, driving a splinter through his visor and into his eye. 10 days later, the king was dead. Suddenly, Nostradamus was no longer a curiosity. He was a figure to be feared and consulted. Catherine, widowed and left with young heirs, clutched to any threat of certainty. France was fracturing, and she needed every advantage. Nostradamus became part of her arsenal. She invited him to court, consulted him on matters of succession, war, and even her children's fates. Some chronicles claim she commissioned a horoscope for each of her sons, desperate to know whether they would survive the storms ahead. His answers, enigmatic as always, suggested greatness for some, tragedy for others. To the courtiers who watched, it was both awe-inspiring and unnerving. Here was a man from Provence, neither noble nor cleric, standing beside queens and princes, his words shaping decisions that could change the fate of nations. Some whisper that Catherine relied on him too heavily, that she even used his prophecies to intimidate rivals. For in an age where faith and fear guided politics, the idea that the stars themselves favored her could lend her a cloak of divine inevitability. But not everyone in the court was convinced. The church looked at Nostradamus with suspicion. Astrology hovered in a dangerous gray zone, part science, part heresy. Catherine's reliance on him risked fueling accusations that she trafficked in forbidden arts. Yet, Catherine was shrewd. She never openly proclaimed him a prophet. She allowed him to remain in the ambiguous role of advisor, a man whose knowledge could be dismissed as coincidence, or revered as destiny. For Nostradamus himself, the position was precarious. He knew that proximity to power was as dangerous as it was rewarding. One wrong prediction, one poorly chosen word, and he could find himself accused of treason or sorcery. Yet he played his role carefully, cloaking his prophecies in riddles, ensuring they could always be interpreted in more than one way. It was a delicate dance, and it kept him alive. Still, the spectacle of his influence was undeniable. Imagine the sight. Catherine, the most powerful woman in France, bending over parchment as Nostradamus traced the alignment of the stars, speaking of omens and shadows yet to come. Courtiers holding their breath as he muttered cryptic verses, while the queen listened intently, her expression unreadable. To some, it was superstition. To others, it was proof that the fate of France was not decided on battlefields alone, but in the heavens. The quatrains themselves became like secret weapons. When enemies threatened, Catherine could allude to verses that seemed to promise their downfall. When her son's reigns faltered, she pointed to Nostradamus' words as proof that destiny still held a place for them. In a world where rumor carried as much weight as armies, prophecy was a tool of control. Yet behind the spectacle, Nostradamus remained something of a mystery. He never allowed himself to become a courtier in the usual sense. He kept his home in Salon-de-Provence, far from the intrigues of Paris. He maintained the image of a reluctant prophet, a man whose visions were a burden rather than a gift. Perhaps this distance was his survival strategy, ensuring that he was never fully entangled in the palace's lethal politics. But there's a haunting irony in his relationship with Catherine. For all her reliance on him, for all the weight she gave to his quatrains, the Valois dynasty was doomed. Nostradamus' horoscopes of her children, if indeed they were genuine, proved tragically accurate. One by one, her sons fell, their reigns brief and blood-stained. Francis too died young. Charles IX ruled in cruelty and paranoia before dying in his 20s. Henry III, the last Valois king, was assassinated, leaving the dynasty extinct. Catherine herself lived long enough to see the prophecy of loss fulfilled again and again. And so, while Nostradamus held the ear of the queen, his presence in her court did not prevent catastrophe. If anything, it deepened the aura of fatalism that surrounded the royal family. To some, this was proof of his power, that his words foretold doom with chilling precision. To others, it was evidence of his impotence, a reminder that even prophecy could not alter destiny. Still, the image endured. Nostradamus, the queen's astrologer, standing at the crossroads of history. His quatrains, already spreading through Europe, became inseparable from the legend of Catherine de' Medici, the dark queen who ruled through intrigue and relied on a prophet's riddles to guide her way. It was a partnership that blurred the line between history and myth, ensuring that Nostradamus' legacy will be bound not only to the stars but to the very heart of royal power. And yet, as his influence in France reached its peak, his writings began to take on a life of their own beyond the palace walls. Across Europe, whispers grew louder. Did this man truly hold the key to the future? Were his verses merely allegory, or the script of history itself? That question would carry his name far beyond Catherine's chambers, into the courts of kings, the halls of scholars, and the imaginations of centuries yet to come. Across Europe, Nostradamus' reputation grew not only because of his cryptic verses, but because some of those verses seemed to strike directly at the beating heart of power. His quatrains did not speak in plain proclamations, no names, no dates, no clear declarations. Instead, they painted pictures, a lion struck in the eye, fire raining from the skies, a kingdom torn by betrayal. Yet rulers and subjects alike could not resist filling in the blanks, attaching their fears and hopes to his words. One of his most famous quatrains foretold the tragic death of King Henry II of France. The image of the young lion overcoming the older, piercing his eye through a golden cage, became infamous after Henry's jousting accident. To many, it was proof that Nostradamus was not merely a poet but a prophet who glimpsed the future with terrifying clarity. Catherine de' Medici herself, after the king's death, began to regard him with almost reverential awe, convinced that the stars spoke through his pen. But Henry's fate was not the only royal drama his quatrains seemed to touch. Another verse spoke of the blood of the just shed in London, burned by fire in the year of 66. For decades, it remained an enigma. Then, in 1666, the Great Fire of London consumed the city, following on the heels of plague and civil strife. Suddenly, Nostradamus' words, written a century earlier, appeared prophetic to a grieving people. It was as though the French seer had reached across time to inscribe their suffering in advance. Monarchs across the continent paid attention. In Spain, Philip II, the Catholic king, heard whispers that Nostradamus had predicted the failure of his armada. The 1588 disaster, in which storms and English fire ships decimated his fleet, was later seen as a fulfillment of a quatrain that described a fleet defeated in the north by storms and fire. Whether Nostradamus truly meant Spain's armada or not mattered little. The legend spread, staining the king's ambition with a taint of destiny denied. Even in England, where Elizabeth I defied both pope and king, Nostradamus' quatrains found eager readers. Some interpreted his writings as proof of a triumph over Catholic plots, others as warnings of doom. His mention of a virgin who would rule long and bring prosperity seemed, to many, a poetic portrait of Elizabeth herself. In a world where legitimacy was often challenged, having prophecy on one side was no small advantage. Yet his verses also carried menace. One quatrain warned of the great man struck down in the day by lightning, an evil deed foretold by petition. Scholars centuries later attached this to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, though the match was loose at best. Another spoke of a great leader in the land of the West, struck down suddenly, leaving his nation trembling. In the Cold War, readers pointed to John F. Kennedy or even imagined the specter of nuclear catastrophe. Nostradamus, it seemed, had a way of slipping into every age, his riddles bending to fit each new crisis. But in his own century, the weight of his words pressed most heavily on the fragile French crown. Catherine de' Medici clung to him because his quatrain seemed to confirm what she feared, that her son's reigns would be short, that France itself stood on the brink of ruin. Indeed, Nostradamus seemed to see not only kings but entire nations consumed by fire and sword. He wrote of civil wars, of blood spilled in Paris, of tyrants rising and falling like sparks in a storm. To his supporters, this was proof of divine inspiration. To his detractors, it was cleverness cloaked in mystery. Was it truly prophecy to say that war and fire would scar Europe? Had not every century known the same fate? Perhaps Nostradamus simply understood that rulers rise, empires crumble, and blood flows endlessly through the veins of history. His genius lay in clothing eternal truths in verse so haunting that each new age could not resist claiming them as its own. And yet, there was something uncanny in the way his words seemed to hover at the edge of reality. The Great Fire of London, the fall of the Valois dynasty, the Armada lost at sea. Time and again, His verses seemed to slip into alignment with disaster, like a key fitting into a lock. For believers, this was proof enough. For skeptics, it was coincidence and clever phrasing. For the people who lived through those tragedies, however, it was chilling, like discovering that their suffering had been foreseen, that their lives unfolded in a story already written. In this way, Nostradamus's quatrains became more than poetry. They became mirrors of fate. Kings feared them because they hinted at their downfall. The people feared them because they hinted at apocalypse. And across Europe, the legend of the man who had written history before it happened grew. His book was copied, translated, smuggled. Each reader found in it the shadows of their own time, and in those shadows they saw prophecy. Still, beneath the fascination was an unsettling question. If Nostradamus's words truly foretold the rise and fall of kings, what else had he seen? What future disasters lay hidden in the tangle of his quatrains, waiting for the right year, the right catastrophe, to bring them to life? And so the whispers spread from palace chambers to village taverns. Was Nostradamus merely a poet of riddles, or had he glimpsed the script of destiny itself, where crowns turned to ashes and empires were but sparks in the storm? Before Nostradamus became a figure of legend, before kings and queens sought his counsel, he had walked among the dying. The black swellings of the plague, the stench of decay in the air, the endless tolling of bells, these were the sounds and sights that shaped him. For much of his early life, he was not yet the prophet of Europe, but a physician and apothecary battling the most terrifying enemy of his age, the plague. The pestilence was merciless. It swept through towns and villages like fire, killing without discrimination, rich and poor, young and old, noble and beggar. Nostradamus traveled from city to city in Provence, often risking his own life to treat those whom others abandoned. He prescribed not prayers or charms, but remedies of herbs, clean water, and fresh air. In an age when medicine was shackled by superstition, his methods were radical. He advised burning infected clothing, keeping streets clean, and using hygiene as a shield against the invisible terror. It was not always enough. Nostradamus knew the way to failure. He lost his first wife and children to the plague, powerless to save them despite all his knowledge. That grief carved itself into his soul, shaping the way he saw the world. From that moment, he lived with an awareness of human fragility, of how swiftly joy could collapse into silence. Perhaps it was this wound that later gave his prophecies a haunting tone, because he had seen firsthand how easily entire futures could be erased overnight. The plague was not only a disease of the body, it was a disease of the spirit. Towns crumbled into panic. Families abandoned their sick. Priests delivered last rites until they themselves succumbed. Entire villages lay silent, the fields untended, the animals wandering untethered. It was the kind of devastation that convinced people that the world was ending. And in that atmosphere of fear, prophecy found its deepest roots. People wanted explanations, patterns, a reason behind the chaos. Nostradamus, shaped by loss and survival, would one day provide those words. His medical background left clear traces in his quatrains. Again and again, he wrote of pestilence, cities emptied, corpses piled, great plagues that will return again and again, greater than before. Some read these lines as mere echoes of his own past. Others saw them as terrifying visions of pandemics yet to come. In the 20th and 21st centuries, whenever disease spread, whether the Spanish flu, HIV, or COVID, his verses resurfaced, quoted as if he had foreseen it all. But even in his own time, plague was more than a medical crisis. It was political, social, even spiritual. Entire wars were shaped by it. Armies dissolved as soldiers fell ill. Kings altered campaigns, fearing outbreaks more than enemy swords. For Catherine de' Medici, Nostradamus's experience with disease made him not only a prophet but a practical advisor. She respected him not only for his quatrains but for his survival, for his ability to endure the horrors that felled so many others. In some ways, Nostradamus's confrontation with plague explains the strange duality of his writings. On one hand, they are filled with doom, endless wars, disasters, cities in flames. On the other hand, they carry the wisdom of a man who had seen humanity survive the very worst. His verses warn of catastrophe, but they also whisper of resilience, of rebuilding after the ashes, of kingdoms rising again even after devastation. There is a powerful image often associated with him. Nostradamus, riding through plague-ridden streets, a scarf of herbs tied around his face, stopping at doors marked with signs of death. Behind him, cats piled with bodies. Before him, another household waiting for comfort, for medicine, for hope. Whether exaggerated by legend or grounded in fact, it is an image that captures the essence of the man who would later write of humanity's endless dance with death. His personal grief lingered always. The loss of his wife and children scarred him, but it also drove him to seek patterns in the chaos. If death could arrive so suddenly, if life could vanish without reason, perhaps there was a hidden script behind it all. His quatrains became a way of wrestling with that question. Was the future random, or was it written? The plague taught him that time is fragile, that civilizations can be undone by invisible enemies as much as by swords. It was a lesson that echoed into his visions of the future, where he foresaw not only wars and assassinations, but also great scourges, illnesses that would humble empires and terrify the world. For those who read his works in later centuries, his constant return to plague was perhaps the most chilling. War could be resisted, kings could be challenged, but plague was unstoppable, impartial, and inescapable. In this sense, his prophecies about pestilence still resonate, because they capture one of the oldest human fears, that death can arrive in silence, spread by breath and touch, leaving no safe refuge. And so, even as his reputation grew among kings and queens, Nostradamus never shed the shadow of plague. It haunted his writing, colored his worldview, and gave his words their dark weight. Behind the legend of the prophet stood a physician who had walked through fields of the dead, who had cradled the dying in his arms, and who had lost his own family to the invisible enemy. That experience made him not only a seer of fate, but also a witness to humanity's most fragile hour. The man who became Europe's prophet was, at his core, a survivor of plague, and the scars of that survival are written into every line of his mysterious verses. In 1555, a slim, enigmatic volume began to circulate through the printing houses of Lyon. Bound in plain leather, its pages carried no elaborate illustrations, no gilded borders, only hundreds of short, cryptic stanzas. Yet within those verses lay the seeds of a legend that would outlive kings and empires. The book was Les Prophecies, Nostradamus's great work, later known as the Centuries. It was not his first publication. Nostradamus had already written almanacs filled with predictions for the year ahead, and these had earned him attention, both admiration and suspicion. But Les Prophecies was different. This was no annual guide to harvests and weather. It was a sprawling tapestry of the future, stretching across centuries, its verses arranged in 10 centuries of 100 quatrains each. Not all were complete, but the ambition was clear. Nostradamus was not writing for 1 year, or 1 court, but for all time. The language itself seemed designed to provoke mystery. French blended with Latin, Greek, and Occitan. Historical allusions blurred with riddles. Images of fire, blood, crowns, and stars wove through every page. There were no clear dates, no explicit names, only hints, metaphors, and symbols. A king slain in joust, a city burning by fire, a great empire crumbling from within. Each verse was a puzzle waiting to be solved, or perhaps a mirror waiting for history to catch its reflection. When the book first appeared, its effect was electric. In taverns, scholars and merchants pored over its lines, arguing late into the night about what they might mean. In the courts of Europe, whispers spread that Nostradamus had dared to write the fate of kings. Some quatrains were interpreted as foretelling the rise of the Antichrist, others as predicting floods, earthquakes, or wars yet to come. The sheer vagueness of the writing was its power. Anyone could find their own fears within it. Catherine de Medici, already intrigued by Nostradamus, reportedly obtained a copy almost immediately. To her, the quatrains were not idle verse. They were warnings and weapons. If her rivals feared the future, she could use these writings to reinforce her own aura of destiny. And when tragedy struck, such as the death of Henry II, she could point to Nostradamus's verses as proof that fate had spoken. The church was less amused. Prophecy belonged to Scripture, not to men. Nostradamus's book hovered dangerously close to heresy, and some theologians condemned it outright. Yet it was difficult to ban something that spread so rapidly, copied in secret, carried across borders by traders and scholars. Like whispers of forbidden knowledge, the verses found their way into libraries and households far from Lyon, taking on a life of their own. What made the century so captivating was not only what they seemed to predict, but how they invited interpretation. Each age would find its own reflection in the verses. In the 16th century, readers saw warnings of civil war in France, of Protestant and Catholic blood staining the streets. In the 17th, they found the fall of the Spanish Armada and the Great Fire of London. Centuries later, readers would claim Nostradamus had foreseen Napoleon, Hitler, even the atomic bomb. The words were elastic, stretching to fit whatever crisis haunted the present. This adaptability was part of Nostradamus's genius, or his cunning. By leaving his quatrains vague, symbolic, and open-ended, he ensured that they would never be confined to one time or place. To some, this was proof of his foresight. He had written in riddles because the future itself was a riddle. To others, it was evidence of clever manipulation. By speaking in symbols, he guaranteed relevance forever. But the effect was undeniable. The centuries gave Nostradamus a permanence beyond the favor of any queen or king. Monarchs could fall, empires could crumble, but his book endured, copied, reprinted, debated. It became a text not of one century but of all centuries, a haunting presence that lingered in the European imagination. At the heart of this book was a profound question. Was history random, or did it follow a hidden pattern? For a continent racked by war, plague, and upheaval, the idea that events were foreseen, even if dimly, was strangely comforting. If disaster could be predicted, perhaps it could be understood. And if it could be understood, perhaps it was not meaningless chaos but part of some greater design. Yet, the shadow of dread never left the pages. Nostradamus did not promise salvation. He promised only that tragedy would come again and again, in cycles of fire and sword. His book was both a mirror of suffering and a reminder that history's wheel never stops turning. For those who read it, the future was not a blank page but a scroll already written, waiting only to be unrolled. As the centuries spread, so too did the legend of its author. No longer merely an astrologer or physician, Nostradamus became something more, a prophet of time itself, a man who had trapped the centuries within his verse. Whether he had truly seen the future or merely captured the eternal rhythm of human conflict mattered less than the effect. His book haunted readers with a suspicion that destiny was already sealed. And so, from the quiet press rooms of Lyon to the courts of Europe, the centuries began its journey through history. Each age would claim it, each age would fear it, and each age would leave it more deeply entwined with the myth of Nostradamus. From the moment Nostradamus's writings began to circulate widely, they divided the world into two camps, those who believed he was touched by divine foresight, and those who dismissed him as a charlatan cloaked in riddles. Few figures of the Renaissance inspired such fierce devotion and equally fierce suspicion. His quatrains became battlegrounds, not only for interpretations of the future but for the credibility of prophecy itself. Among the believers, Nostradamus was no ordinary astrologer. To them, he was a vessel of destiny, chosen to glimpse what others could not. His supporters often pointed to specific quatrains that seemed to align uncannily with real events. When King Henry II perished in the jousting accident that Nostradamus was said to have predicted, believers saw undeniable proof of his prophetic gift. Catherine de' Medici, impressed and unnerved in equal measure, placed a trust in him, elevating him to royal advisor. This royal endorsement only deepened conviction of those who already saw him as a prophet. For these followers, the obscurity of his verses was not a flaw but a necessity. They argued that clear predictions would invite disaster, tempting men to alter fate or misuse knowledge of the future. The ambiguity, they claimed, was intentional, prophecy veiled in shadow so that it could only be understood when the time was right. This idea of hidden knowledge made Nostradamus even more alluring. Each quatrain became a locked chest, waiting for history itself to provide the key. But the critics saw the same ambiguity as the greatest proof of fraud. Learned men of the universities accused him of deliberately writing in vague, twisted phrases, so that anything could later be made to fit. He tells us what has happened after it has happened. One detractor sneered, and calls it foresight. To them, Nostradamus was not a seer but a master of clever phrasing, exploiting the human tendency to find patterns where none existed. Some accused him of worse, of dabbling in forbidden arts, of trafficking with demons. The Church, always wary of prophecy outside the Scriptures, kept a cautious eye on his growing influence. While Nostradamus carefully avoided overtly religious claims in his writings, the very act of foretelling drew suspicion. Theologians argued that true prophecy could come only from God, and Nostradamus, a man of astrology and alchemy, was at best misguided, at worst a heretic. Despite these condemnations, his popularity only grew. His almanac sold in the thousands, and the century spread from hand to hand, discussed in taverns, universities, and royal courts alike. For every scholar who dismissed him, there were merchants, peasants, and nobles eager to believe that the chaos of their world had already been foreseen. France was a nation racked by plague, famine, and religious war. In such a time, the idea that these terrors were part of a larger pattern gave comfort, even if the pattern promised more suffering. The tension between believers and skeptics was not confined to his lifetime. After his death, the debate only intensified. Each new catastrophe in Europe, wars, revolutions, assassinations, was seized upon by believers as proof of Nostradamus' accuracy. Skeptics countered that the quatrains were so obscure that they could be stretched to fit anything. The Great Fire of London, the French Revolution, even the rise of Napoleon, each event was found in his verses after the fact. To critics, this retrofitting was evidence of human imagination, not divine foresight. To believers, it was proof that his work was timeless. Part of what fueled the divide was the nature of prophecy itself. Humans are drawn to meaning, to the belief that events unfold according to some design. Nostradamus' writings offered exactly that, a glimpse into a preordained script. Those who rejected him often rejected not only his methods, but the very idea that the future could be known. To admit his accuracy would mean admitting that free will was an illusion, that history was fixed like ink on parchment. Believers, however, saw the matter differently. To them, Nostradamus did not abolish free will. He revealed destiny's broad strokes. One could not prevent the tide, but one could prepare for the flood. His words were warnings, not chains. They gave a sense of control in an uncontrollable world, a way to face disaster with a real assurance that it had already been foreseen. This clash of perspectives echoed through the centuries. In every era, Nostradamus found both champions and enemies. During the Enlightenment, rationalists dismiss him as superstition, while mystics embrace him as proof of hidden truths. In modern times, scientists scoff at his lack of precision, while conspiracy theorists pore over his quatrains, convinced he predicted world wars, assassinations, and even the end of the world. The irony is that both sides, in their own way, keep his legacy alive. The critics, by refuting him, ensure that his name remains a subject of debate. The believers, by defending him, ensure that his verses remain studied, interpreted, and applied to every new crisis. Nostradamus thrives in the tension between faith and doubt, between skepticism and belief. Without his critics, he might have faded into obscurity. Without his believers, his quatrains might never have left the page. And so, the centuries-long argument continues. Was Nostradamus truly a prophet who glimpsed the shape of the future? Or was he merely a skilled writer, weaving vagueness into poetry that could outlast time? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the verses themselves, but in the human hunger for meaning. His quatrains endure because we need them to endure, because in the shifting shadows of history we long for a voice that claims to know what comes next. For in the end, Nostradamus is less a man than a mirror. Believers see in him the certainty of fate. Critics see in him the folly of superstition. And both, unknowingly, keep alive the flame of his legend. Across the centuries, few themes in Nostradamus' writings have provoked more fascination, fear, and debate than his visions of the apocalypse. While many of his quatrains deal with wars, plagues, and kings, a select few seem to describe the ultimate unraveling of the world itself. These verses are among the darkest in the centuries, filled with fire from the skies, oceans boiling, cities swallowed whole, and humanity facing its final reckoning. To his readers, they are not just warnings of specific disasters, but glimpses into the fate of civilization. The Renaissance was already a world familiar with the idea of the apocalypse. Christian Europe lived under the shadow of Revelation, the biblical prophecy of fire, beasts, and the return of Christ. Nostradamus, steeped in scripture as well as astrology, knew how powerfully apocalyptic imagery gripped the human imagination. But unlike Revelation, his apocalyptic verses were scattered and fragmented, appearing unexpectedly among predictions of everyday plagues and battles. This randomness gave them an even more unsettling quality. The end of the world might arrive not as a divine story's climax, but as one more event in the chaotic march of history. One quatrain, often cited by believers, speaks of the sky igniting and fire descending upon the earth. To modern interpreters, this has been read as a vision of nuclear war, with missiles blazing across the night and cities reduced to ash. Others argue it could describe a comet or asteroid strike, a catastrophe that would plunge the world into darkness. Nostradamus never gave clear dates, but the imagery resonates in every era when humanity fears its own destruction. Another passage hints of the seas rising beyond their bounds, drowning coastal lands and leaving survivors desperate for food and refuge. In a time when climate change dominates headlines, believers point to these verses as evidence that Nostradamus foresaw environmental collapse centuries before the science of climate even existed. Skeptics counter that floods have been a part of human experience for millennia, and it takes little imagination to predict that they would continue. Yet the haunting precision of his language, water covering great cities, islands vanishing, makes it difficult to dismiss entirely. Then there are the verses that describe famine and fire consuming Europe, Asia, and the New World alike, leaving only fragments of humanity alive. Some interpreters see echoes of global war, others a pandemic beyond any seen before. Nostradamus, after all, lived through the Black Death and outbreaks of plague that wiped out entire towns. He knew how quickly disease could reduce even the strongest society to corpses and silence. His apocalyptic predictions often carry the chilling realism of a man who had walked among the dying and smelled the stench of mass graves. What makes Nostradamus' apocalyptic visions particularly terrifying is the ambiguity of their timing. Unlike some prophets, he did not tie the end of days to a specific year. Instead, he suggested that great cycles of destruction would come, each worse than the last, until the final collapse. This uncertainty allows every generation to imagine that the end might be theirs. In times of peace, his apocalyptic quatrains are treated as curiosities. In times of crisis, they feel like the voice of doom whispering across centuries. During the Cold War, for instance, Nostradamus was resurrected as a prophet of nuclear annihilation. His verses about fire from the sky were interpreted as references to missiles, mushroom clouds, and radiation. Books and films of the era sold millions of copies by linking his predictions to the United States and the Soviet Union locked in deadly rivalry. For a frightened public, his warnings seemed chillingly relevant. When the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of destruction, some even believed they were living through the fulfillment of his apocalyptic prophecies. In the modern era, his predictions have been tied to new fears: climate catastrophe, pandemics, artificial intelligence, and global conflict. After the 9th of November, verses describing 2 great rocks and cities burning were circulated widely as proof that Nostradamus had seen the Twin Towers fall. During the COVID-19 pandemic, quatrains about plague and quarantine were resurrected once more, shared in whispers and viral posts. Each time humanity faces a new crisis, his apocalyptic imagery returns, reshaped to fit the moment. But perhaps the most chilling of his prophecies speaks of a time after great wars and floods, when humanity itself seems changed. Few shall be left to repopulate the earth. This vision suggests not just destruction but transformation, a world in which the survivors are forced to begin anew, stripped of their old powers and certainties. Whether this points to nuclear winter, ecological collapse, or something stranger, the message is clear: no empire, no kingdom, not even humanity itself is immune to the forces of fate. Critics argue, of course, that these apocalyptic quatrains are simply reflections of fears common in Nostradamus' own era. Europe was racked by religious wars, famines, and outbreaks of plague. To imagine these disasters expanding to a global scale was a natural extension of his worldview, not supernatural foresight. The end of the world, they say, has always been just over the horizon. And yet, the reason his apocalyptic verses endure is not because they are precise, but because they speak to something universal in the human psyche, the fear that everything we build can vanish in an instant. Whether by plague, fire, flood, or our own inventions, the fragility of civilization is undeniable. Nostradamus, through the veil of his obscure poetry, captured that truth with a clarity that transcends a century. For his believers, the prophecies of apocalypse serve as warnings to prepare, to change, perhaps even to avert disaster. For skeptics, they are grim poetry, a reminder that humans have always lived with a shadow of their own extinction. But for both, they remain unforgettable, haunting the imagination with the possibility that somewhere in those cryptic lines lies the script of our final act. And so, The question lingers, as it has for nearly 500 years. Are Nostradamus' apocalyptic visions mere reflections of the fears of his time, or are they glimpses of a future humanity has not yet reached? Each new disaster, each new crisis, pushes us to ask again whether we are moving closer to the world he foresaw, or whether, in reading his words, we are writing the prophecy ourselves. Among the most dramatic upheavals in European history, the French Revolution stands as a storm that toppled monarchs, reshaped nations, and ushered in a new age of politics and ideology. To many readers of Nostradamus, the revolution was not only a historical inevitability, but something foreseen centuries earlier in the cryptic lines of the centuries. His quatrains, scattered with images of mobs, blood, and kings brought low, were reinterpreted as uncanny previews of the chaos that engulfed France between 1789 and 1799. One of the most frequently cited verses speaks of a great city trembling with upheaval, its citizens rising in fury, and noble blood flowing in the streets. For believers, the imagery perfectly captured Paris at the height of revolutionary fervor, the storming of the Bastille, the march on Versailles, the terror of guillotines raised against aristocrats. They saw in Nostradamus' words not only symbolic foreshadowing but chillingly specific echoes of the revolution's most infamous acts. In another quatrain, Nostradamus describes a king being forced from power, mocked, and eventually executed. For interpreters writing after 1793, this verse seemed tailor-made for the fate of Louis XVI, who was dethroned, imprisoned, tried, and ultimately led to the guillotine. The Queen, Marie Antoinette, suffered the same fate, and Nostradamus' lines about a proud lady meeting ruin at the hands of the people were held up as further proof of prophecy fulfilled. Yet perhaps the most haunting are the quatrains that seem to describe not only the downfall of kings but the rise of terror itself. Nostradamus writes of fire and steel, of heads falling uncounted, and of ordinary citizens turning upon each other in fury. To later generations, these lines echo the reign of terror, when Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety unleashed purges that devoured nobles and revolutionaries alike. The sense of chaos, of a nation consuming itself, resonated with Nostradamus' darker predictions. The fascination with Nostradamus' connection to the revolution did not emerge only after the fact. Even during the revolution itself, pamphlets circulated drawing links between current events and his quatrains. In the tumult of Paris, where fear and rumor spread faster than fire, Nostradamus' verses offer both dread and a strange form of comfort. If these horrors had been foreseen centuries ago, perhaps they were not meaningless chaos but part of some larger destiny. Critics, of course, were quick to argue that these interpretations were retrofitted after the blood had already been spilled. They pointed out that Nostradamus wrote in general terms, cities, kings, upheaval, that could apply to countless wars and revolts across history. France had experienced uprisings before, and it would again. To claim his words referred specifically to the French Revolution was, in their eyes, an exercise in selective reading. Yet even skeptics admitted that the parallels were striking. Few events in history matched his imagery of aristocracy brought low and mobs rising from the streets with such uncanny force. Believers countered that while his words were vague enough to survive centuries, their power lay in how perfectly they aligned with the revolution's defining moments. The guillotine, especially, seemed like the literal fulfillment of his lines about heads severed by steel. Beyond specific events, Nostradamus' verses also seemed to capture the spirit of the revolution. The sense that the old order had collapsed and a new world was being born in fire and blood. His imagery of crowns shattered, temples burned, and nations remade resonated deeply with those who lived through the upheaval. Even if he had not described every detail, the mood of his prophecy seemed to echo the mood of France itself: rage, destruction, and transformation. Perhaps most chilling are the interpretations that suggest Nostradamus foresaw not only the revolution but the rise of Napoleon in its aftermath. Quatrains mentioning a figure born near Italy, rising from humble origins to command Europe, were later tied to the Corsican general who emerged from the revolutionary armies. In this reading, the revolution was not merely predicted as an isolated event but as the opening act of an even greater drama. For believers, this continuity was proof of Nostradamus' foresight. He had seen not just the fall of kings but the birth of new emperors, not just revolution but the wars that would follow it across Europe. For skeptics, it was more evidence of clever reinterpretation, with Napoleon's rise retroactively woven into the fabric of quatrains written centuries before. The The French Revolution remains one of the best examples of how Nostradamus' writings are endlessly reinterpreted. To the fearful, his verses were warnings of doom. To the hopeful, they were signs that the old order's fall had been destined. To the skeptical, they were proof of humanity's tendency to bend prophecy to fit history. But no matter the perspective, the revolution ensured that Nostradamus' name would echo alongside the greatest upheavals of modern history. What is most remarkable is how his shadow lingers even now. In documentaries, books, and discussions about the revolution, Nostradamus still appears, a figure who supposedly foresaw the fury of the Parisian street centuries before they erupted. His quatrains are read not only as records of the past, but as reminders that every revolution might have been foreseen, every collapse of power already written in cryptic verse. And so, the French Revolution becomes not just a story of kings and guillotines, but another chapter in the legend of Nostradamus. Did he truly glimpse those terrible days? Or did his verses simply reflect universal patterns of power and downfall that history repeats again and again? The answer, as ever with Nostradamus, remains uncertain, caught between prophecy and interpretation, between history and myth. If the French Revolution was a storm that shattered the old order, Napoleon Bonaparte was the lightning that followed. Rising from obscurity on the island of Corsica, he transformed himself into a general, then a ruler, and finally an emperor who would reshape Europe. For readers of Nostradamus, the meteoric rise of Napoleon was not a surprise at all. It was already written in the cryptic quatrains centuries earlier. One of the most frequently cited verses speaks of a figure born near Italy who would rise to dominate Europe, leading armies across mountains and seas. Napoleon, born in Corsica, a Mediterranean island lying close to Italy, seemed to fit the description perfectly. Believers seized upon the connection, declaring Nostradamus had not only foreseen the revolution but the iron hand that would emerge from its chaos. Other quatrains speak of a great leader with humble origins who would make the empire grow, conquering nations before finally falling. Napoleon, the son of minor nobility with no fortune, appeared to embody this prophecy. His ascent from a provincial artillery officer to emperor of France mirrored the archetype of destiny carved into Nostradamus' poetry. Believers point to lines that describe the conquest of Italy, battles in Egypt, and the crossing of the Alps, all major moments in Napoleon's career. Each campaign seemed to echo the imagery of Nostradamus' writings, armies surging like waves, kings cast down, the eagle rising to command Europe. To those who search for patterns, the fit was uncanny. One particularly striking prophecy mentions a leader called Napoleon Roy, which some interpreters argue is a near-direct naming of Napoleon. The quatrain describes him as a tyrant whose reign would bring both glory and suffering to Europe. Critics dismiss this as either coincidence or a mistranslation shaped to fit the narrative, but for believers it is one of the most direct validations of Nostradamus' gift. To them, it was as though Nostradamus had reached across the centuries and inscribed Napoleon's very name into his book of fate. Napoleon's wars, which engulfed nearly all of Europe, seemed to fulfill Nostradamus' visions of great battles and rivers of blood. The quatrains that spoke of cities under siege, empires collapsing, and monarchs dethroned were read as perfect reflections of the Napoleonic Wars. From Spain to Russia, Napoleon left a trail of both triumph and devastation that seemed to animate the prophesies. Even Napoleon's downfall appeared foreshadowed. Verses describing a great leader defeated in the north, forced into exile, and eventually undone by the turning of fate were linked to his disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812 and his eventual exile to Elba. When he returned for the 100 days only to be crushed at Waterloo and exiled again, this time to St. Helena, believers saw Nostradamus' predictions fulfilled to the letter. The imagery of the mighty humbled, the conqueror turned prisoner, seemed to echo through the centuries. The parallels grew stronger still with Napoleon's legacy. Nostradamus spoke of a leader whose influence would stretch beyond his lifetime, whose name would haunt Europe even after his fall. Napoleon's reforms, his legal codes, and the redrawing of European borders continued to shape nations long after his death. To those who sought prophecy in Nostradamus, it was proof that even the shadow of this Corsican general had been glimpsed centuries before. Yet, as with all Nostradamus' predictions, skeptics offered a different interpretation. They argued that the quatrains cited in relation to Napoleon could easily be applied to many other rulers throughout history. A leader born near Italy could describe dozens of figures. A man of humble origins rising to power is hardly unique. The wars, battles, and falls described in Nostradamus' writings were broad enough to apply to countless military leaders across the centuries. Moreover, critics claim that the so-called Napoleon Roy quatrain had been mistranslated and stretched beyond recognition. To them, the link to Napoleon's actual name was a case of reading modern meaning into Renaissance poetry rather than proof of supernatural foresight. They argue that humans, desperate for patterns, reshaped Nostradamus' vague language to match what had already occurred. Still, the persistence of Napoleon in the Nostradamus legend speaks to more than skepticism or belief. Napoleon himself became a figure of destiny, a man who seemed larger than life, his rise and fall almost mythic in scope. It was inevitable that people would turn to prophecy to explain him. His presence in Nostradamus' quatrains gave the sense that history itself had already been foretold, that Napoleon was not merely a man but an actor in a cosmic script. What is most fascinating is how Napoleon's story and Nostradamus' prophecies laid the groundwork for future interpretations. If Napoleon could be found in the quatrains, then why not Hitler? Why not world wars, revolutions, or apocalyptic disasters yet to come? In linking Napoleon to Nostradamus, believers created a template. Whenever a figure of immense power rises, Nostradamus must have already spoken of him. In this way, Napoleon became both a subject and a precedent. His story, with its dizzying rise and catastrophic fall, seemed to embody the essence of prophecy itself: glory, tragedy, inevitability. Whether Nostradamus truly saw him or whether history bent the verses to fit him, Napoleon ensured that Nostradamus would not be remembered only as a mystic of plague-ridden France, but as a prophet for all ages. The conqueror of Europe may have died in exile, far from the throne he once claimed, but in the pages of Nostradamus' quatrains he lives on, as both proof for believers and a puzzle for skeptics. His rise and fall remind us of the central tension in Nostradamus' legend. Do his prophecies reveal the future, or do we, yearning for meaning, force the future to fit his words? And so, Napoleon's ghost lingers in the shadow of prophecy, his name spoken not just in the halls of history, but in the whispered debates over destiny, fate, and the strange words of the seer who wrote them centuries before. When the 20th century erupted in violence on a scale humanity had never witnessed before, Nostradamus' quatrains resurfaced with renewed urgency. 2 global wars, millions dead, empires shattered, and new powers rising from the ruins. These were the very images that seemed to haunt his writings. To many, it appeared that Nostradamus had looked centuries ahead and described the wars that would redefine civilization itself. For believers, some of the most compelling quatrains were those that spoke of a great conflict spreading across the world, consuming nations in fire and steel. Lines that described entire regions burning, oceans filled with fleets, and the skies filled with smoke were interpreted as uncanny previews of World War I. The imagery of trenches, poisoned air, and mechanized slaughter seemed to echo the dark poetry of Nostradamus' verses. His words about iron beasts and fields turned to dust were read as references to tanks, artillery, and the devastation of industrialized warfare. Even more striking, however, were the quatrains tied to World War II. Many interpreters pointed to the rise of Hitler, whom they believed Nostradamus had directly foreseen. Verses mentioning a figure from the depths of Western Europe, born to poor parents, who would command vast armies and bring suffering to millions, were seized upon as descriptions of the Nazi dictator. The supposed reference to Hister, a word that actually referred to the lower Danube River but was reimagined as Hitler, became one of the most famous links between Nostradamus and modern history. According to believers, Nostradamus had not only predicted Hitler's rise but also his alliance with another tyrant in the East, interpreted as Mussolini or even Japan. Quatrains that spoke of 2 great powers joining to unleash fire were applied to the Axis powers. The imagery of Europe trembling, nations falling, and leaders meeting violent ends seemed to map eerily onto the events of the 1930s and 1940s. One quatrain in particular, describing fire descending upon cities, was later tied to the Blitz, the Allied bombings, and ultimately Hiroshima and Nagasaki. For those who lived through the war, it was impossible not to see the shadow of Nostradamus looming over the mushroom clouds and burning cities. His word became part of wartime propaganda, used both by the Allies and the Axis to claim destiny was on their side. In Germany, Nazi propagandists published interpretations of Nostradamus predicting a German victory, while in Britain, counter-propagandists circulated claiming the opposite. Even in the midst of real war, Nostradamus was weaponized as a tool of psychological warfare. The idea that he had foreseen the Second World War carried a chilling allure. His verses seem to describe not just the rise of Hitler, but also his downfall, an evil figure undone by his own ambition, leading his nation into ruin. When Hitler fell and Europe lay in ruins, many declared it as final proof that Nostradamus had looked across the centuries and seen both the fire and the ashes. Yet skeptics have always offered sharp counters to these claims. They argue that the Hister quatrain was twisted to fit Hitler's name, ignoring its original geographical meaning. The images of burning cities, great wars, and tyrants are so universal that they could be applied to countless conflicts in history. The fact that both sides in World War II used Nostradamus for propaganda only proves, they say, that his words were vague enough to be manipulated endlessly. But what cannot be denied is the emotional power of these connections. During the chaos of World War, people longed for explanations, for signs that the horrors had meaning. Nostradamus's quatrains, with their cryptic yet evocative language, provided just that. They gave a sense that the suffering was not random, that it had been seen before, that history was following a script written long ago. Even beyond the wars themselves, Nostradamus's verses seemed to anticipate the global order they created. Quatrains that spoke of power shifting westward, of a new land rising across the sea, were interpreted as references to the United States emerging as a superpower. Others that describe Eastern nations rising with strength were linked to the Soviet Union and later China. In these readings, the world that emerged after 1945, the Cold War, the nuclear arms race, the bipolar order, was all part of the pattern Nostradamus had foreseen. The world wars also fed into one of the most enduring legends of Nostradamus, his three antichrists. Believers identified Napoleon as the first, Hitler as the second, and began to speculate about who the third might be. In this narrative, the wars of the 20th century were not isolated tragedies, but chapters in a prophecy of ultimate destruction. The sense of inevitability, of destiny unfolding, made Nostradamus's writing feel not just relevant but urgent. Whether viewed as genuine prophecy or clever coincidence, Nostradamus's supposed predictions of the world war cemented his place in the modern imagination. No longer was he just a Renaissance mystic, scribbling obscure verses in plague-ridden France. He was a prophet whose words seemed to stretch across centuries, touching even the most modern of catastrophes. His verses became part of the cultural memory of the wars, quoted in newspapers, pamphlets, and even films. In the end, the world wars gave Nostradamus new life. His writings, once confined to scholars and mystics, were now household references, debated by soldiers, civilians, and leaders alike. The imagery of fire, tyrants, and destruction had found its stage, and history itself seemed to play along. And yet, as always, the final question remains unresolved. Did Nostradamus truly foresee the trenches of the summer, the rise of Hitler, the flames of Hiroshima? Or did a desperate, grieving world impose its tragedies onto his cryptic poetry, finding meaning where none existed? Perhaps that is the greatest power of Nostradamus. Not the accuracy of his predictions, but their ability to mirror the fears of every age. In the 20th century, those fears were painted in the fire and blood of world wars, and Nostradamus was there, his shadow cast across the battlefield. Among the most haunting and hotly debated elements of Nostradamus's writings is his idea of the three antichrists. Over centuries, interpreters have declared that Napoleon was the first, Hitler the second, and that a mysterious, unnamed third figure is yet to come. This looming prophecy has fascinated believers and frightened skeptics alike, for it suggests that history is not finished with its darkest chapters, that one more tyrant, greater and more destructive than those before him, will rise to plunge the world into chaos. The quatrains that supposedly describe the third Antichrist are scattered, cryptic, and shrouded in ambiguity. Unlike the clearer references interpreters see in Napoleon or Hitler, the identity of the third is left frustratingly vague. Nostradamus spoke of a figure rising from the east, perhaps from the Middle East or Asia, who would unite vast armies and spread devastation across continents. Some quatrains describe a dark force from the east, a king of terror descending from the skies, or a cruel master of blood and iron who would unleash a war unlike any before. Believers insist these verses foretell not just another tyrant, but an apocalyptic leader, someone whose reign will coincide with immense suffering, famine, natural disasters, and perhaps even the end of civilization. Unlike Napoleon and Hitler, who are tied to specific eras. This third Antichrist is envisioned as a culmination, the final embodiment of destructive power that Nostradamus foresaw. Throughout history, attempts to identify this figure have shifted with the fears of the age. In the Cold War, many were convinced it referred to the Soviet Union or its leaders, imagining nuclear war as a fulfillment of Nostradamus's grim vision. When tensions flared in the Middle East, some saw Saddam Hussein or Osama bin Laden as candidates for the third Antichrist. Others looked toward Asia, speculating that rising powers like China might play the role Nostradamus foretold. Even modern political figures, controversial presidents, dictators, and warlords, have been accused of fitting into this prophetic mold. The imagery of destruction in these quatrains is especially vivid. They describe rivers of blood, cities consumed by fire, and entire nations brought to their knees. Some verses even mention the unleashing of weapons so terrible that the earth itself would tremble, a detail often linked to nuclear war in modern interpretations. For many, this makes the prophecy of the third Antichrist not just about one man, but about the ultimate war humanity might wage against itself. The speculation does not end with political or military leaders. Some interpreters take a more symbolic approach, suggesting that the third Antichrist is not a single person at all, but a force, an ideology, or even a system that brings destruction. In this view, the Antichrist could be modern technology misused, artificial intelligence spiraling out of control, or climate catastrophe triggered by human greed. Nostradamus's vague language leaves enough room for these broader, almost metaphorical readings. What makes the third Antichrist prophecy so captivating is its unfinished nature. When Napoleon and Hitler are identified, people feel as though they are waiting for the final chapter of a trilogy. The first two figures cause immense suffering, but their reigns, however brutal, were finite. The third is imagined as something far worse, an endgame scenario. This anticipation gives the prophecy a living, breathing quality. Each time the world faces turmoil, from terrorist attacks to global pandemics to rising international tensions, people return to Nostradamus, scouring his verses for signs that the third Antichrist has arrived. During major world events, such as the Gulf War, 9/11, or the conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East, Nostradamus's quatrains are circulated widely, especially online, as supposed proof that he had predicted them. His words about fire in the new city or a great war beginning in the East are quoted as evidence that the Antichrist is among us. Whether these interpretations hold any real accuracy is beside the point. The fact remains that Nostradamus continues to provide a mirror for humanity's fears. Skeptics, of course, argue that this entire framework is flawed. They point out that the idea of three antichrists is not clearly laid out in Nostradamus' writings, but is instead a structure imposed by later interpreters. Napoleon and Hitler were retroactively fitted into prophecy because they seemed to embody the evil that people expected. In this view, the third Antichrist is simply a placeholder for the next great villain in history, whoever that may be. Human beings, they argue, will always create tyrants, and Nostradamus' vague poetry will always be flexible enough to apply to them. And yet, the fascination endures. The third Antichrist has become not just a Nostradamian figure, but a cultural archetype. He represents the ultimate fear of the unknown future, that somewhere, someone is waiting to rise, to plunge humanity into darkness one last time. Books, films, and television shows have explored this theme, portraying apocalyptic leaders who seem to step straight out of Nostradamus' pages. The prophecy lives on not just in scholarly debates but in popular imagination, feeding stories of doom and survival. The real power of the third Antichrist prophecy lies in how it makes us confront our deepest anxieties. Is there truly a final tyrant waiting in the shadows, or is the prophecy a reflection of our own destructive potential? Perhaps the third figure is not an individual at all, but the culmination of human choices, the wars we wage, the weapons we build, the neglect of our planet, the divisions in nature. If so, then Nostradamus' warning is less about fate and more about responsibility. Ultimately, the enigma of the third Antichrist remains unsolved. Nostradamus' verses, with their dark and timeless imagery, continue to invite speculation. For some, they are proof of destiny unfolding step by step. For others, they are a Rorschach test, where humanity projects its fears onto the canvas of prophecy. Either way, the third Antichrist stands as one of the most enduring mysteries of Nostradamus' legacy, a question mark hanging over the future, a shadow we cannot yet name. And as long as humanity fears war, tyranny, and destruction, the prophecy will never fade. It will be retold in whispers, in books, in films, and in late-night conversations, carrying with it the chilling suggestion that the worst is still to come. If Nostradamus' verses about wars and tyrants evoke fear of human ambition, then his quatrains about natural disasters strike an even deeper chord, the fear of nature itself turning against us. Fire, flood, famine, earthquake, and pestilence appear again and again in his writings, woven into a vision of the earth as a restless, vengeful force. For centuries, readers have scoured these lines in search of meaning, trying to decide whether Nostradamus had glimpsed the great disasters of the future or simply captured the eternal fragility of human life before the wrath of nature. One of his most quoted predictions speaks of a great earthquake striking the new city. Some interpreters believe this line points directly to San Francisco, devastated by a massive earthquake in 1906. Others insist it refers to New York, imagining a future catastrophe still to come. The vagueness of New City allows a prophecy to be endlessly reapplied, yet the imagery is chillingly familiar. Towering building collapsing, fires raging, people fleeing in panic as the ground itself betrays them. Another set of verses describes floods drowning nations and great lands swallowed by the sea. Modern readers see in these quatrains echoes of climate change and rising sea levels, envisioning coastal cities submerged as polar ice melts. Earlier interpreters, centuries before, connected them to great floods along the Rhine or the Loire, seeing in Nostradamus a chronicle of tragedies already past. Each era finds its own reflection in his imagery, proving how easily the language of water and destruction can be tied to human fear. He also wrote of fire from the sky and a trail of flame across the heavens. Some saw in these lines predictions of comets, meteors, or even modern missile warfare. When the Tunguska event in 1908 flattened forests in Siberia with a force of 1,000 atomic bombs, some claim Nostradamus had foreseen it. When Halley's comet returned in 1910, newspapers linked it to his verses, stoking public panic. And in the modern age, as scientists warn of near-Earth asteroids, believers continue to point to Nostradamus as a prophet who knew of the dangers centuries before. Perhaps the most terrifying of all his disaster predictions, however, are those that describe famine and plague. One quatrain warns of hunger spreading where once was plenty, the great shall beg for bread. Another speaks of disease moving faster than armies, carried on the wind, unseen, unstoppable. These verses have been tied to the Black Death, which ravaged Europe long before Nostradamus' time, but also to later outbreaks, the influenza of 1918, the AIDS epidemic, even the COVID-19 pandemic. Each time disease sweeps the globe, Nostradamus' name resurfaces, his reputation as a seer renewed by the terror of invisible death. What makes his disaster prophecies so compelling is their dual nature. On one hand, they can be read as warnings of cosmic inevitability, events no human can control, fated to happen regardless of effort. On the other, they resonate with human guilt, as if the disasters are punishment for arrogance, greed, or neglect. Floods follow deforestation. Famine follows war. Plague follows a breakdown of social order. Nostradamus' words, though written centuries ago, read like a mirror of humanity's uneasy relationship with the natural world. Skeptics argue that this is precisely why his prophecies endure. Earthquakes, storms, and plagues are constants in human history, and his language is broad enough to apply to any era. There will always be disasters to match his imagery, and believers will always find comfort, or dread, in the idea that someone had foreseen them. Yet this does not diminish the emotional pull of his words. In fact, it may be the very reason they still feel alive. In times of crisis, when cities burn or storms destroy, people crave a sense of order in chaos. Nostradamus offers that, even if only through the illusion of foresight. His verses transform random catastrophe into part of a larger narrative, suggesting that suffering is not meaningless, but part of a pattern, a destiny. Whether or not this is true, the comfort it provides is undeniable. At the same time, his disaster prophecies serve as a reminder of human vulnerability. Kings may rise and fall, empires may fight for dominance, but in the face of nature's fury, all stand equally helpless. An earthquake makes no distinction between rich and poor. A plague cares nothing for power or wealth. In this way, Nostradamus' writings strip away illusions of control, forcing readers to confront the fragility of their existence. Modern interpreters often emphasize this point by linking his verses to environmental crises. In an age of global warming, extreme weather, and mass extinctions, Nostradamus seems eerily relevant. Did he truly foresee our predicament, or are we simply reading our fears into his poetry? That question, once again, does not matter as much as the effect. His quatrains serve as both prophecy and parable, warnings that may be literal predictions, or timeless truths about the cost of ignoring nature's balance. And so, each time disaster strikes, when a tsunami devastates a coastline, when a hurricane lays waste to cities, when a pandemic sweeps across nations, his words rise again, whispered in awe or fear. The disasters themselves may be natural, but the need to believe they were foreseen, that they fit into some greater plan, is profoundly human. Nostradamus knew this, and whether by design or by instinct, he wrote in a way that would always resonate with that need. These disaster prophecies remind us that while tyrants and wars are born of human choice, nature remains the ultimate force, indifferent and immense. Nostradamus's gift was to capture that terror in words that could echo across centuries. His disasters are not just predictions, they are mirrors reflecting our fear of the world we cannot control. If Nostradamus's visions of floods, plagues, and earthquakes reflect the timeless wrath of nature, then his most chilling prophecies speak of something far more sinister, the destruction humanity could bring upon itself. Within his quatrains are references of fire from the sky, cities consumed in an instant, and a final war that scorches the earth. To many modern interpreters, these images seem eerily aligned with a nightmare of nuclear war, a terror Nostradamus could not have imagined in the 16th century, yet one that his words appear to describe with haunting precision. The atomic bomb changed everything in 1945. When Hiroshima and Nagasaki were obliterated in seconds, the world crossed into a new age, the age of nuclear fire. Almost immediately, Nostradamus's writings were dragged into the conversation. One oft-cited verse spoke of 2 cities afflicted by scourge, never seen before, famine within plague, people put out by steel. To some, this seemed like an uncanny description of the Japanese cities struck by atomic devastation. The imagery of a scourge never seen before fit neatly into the horror of nuclear weapons, unlike any other force unleashed by human hands. Other quatrains mention fire in the new city and a great flame falling from the sky at night. During the Cold War, these lines were reinterpreted as descriptions of nuclear missiles streaking across the heavens. The fear of mutually assured destruction, entire cities annihilated in minutes, seemed to echo Nostradamus's warnings of a fire that would leave nothing but ashes. To those who believed, the connection was clear. The prophet of Provence had seen not just the wars of his own time, but the weapons of humanity's darkest future. In the tense decades of the Cold War, his reputation grew stronger than ever. Every crisis, the Cuban Missile Standoff in 1962, the arms race of the 1980s, was viewed through the lens of Nostradamus. Readers saw in his verses predictions of mushroom clouds, skies darkened with smoke, and rivers poisoned beyond salvation. One quatrain describing living things turned to cinders was linked directly to the effects of radiation, though such an idea would have been unimaginable in the Renaissance. Yet skeptics remind us that these interpretations are not so straightforward. Nostradamus wrote in broad strokes, with imagery that could apply to firestorms, sieges, or even natural disasters. The apocalyptic language of fire and ruin was common in his time, reflecting fears of divine wrath rather than nuclear war. To those who doubt, the nuclear interpretation is just another case of retrofitting, taking vague poetry and making it match whatever catastrophe haunts the present day. But for believers, the coincidences are too powerful to dismiss. Some go further, arguing that Nostradamus foresaw not just the atomic bomb, but World War III itself, a conflict that would dwarf all others in scale and destruction. His quatrains describing the Great War of the Third Age or the final battle beginning in the East are often tied to visions of nuclear holocaust. In these readings, Nostradamus did not merely predict weapons of fire, but the very war that might end civilization. These interpretations found new life after the fall of the Soviet Union, when fears of rogue states and nuclear terrorism replaced the old standoff between superpowers. Suddenly, Nostradamus's references to fire in the desert or weapons hidden in the East were tied to the Middle East, with some claiming he had predicted the Gulf War or the invasion of Iraq. After the 9th of November, his words about a new city struck by terror circulated wildly, twisted into supposed proof that he had foreseen both the attacks and the wars that followed. Even now, in an era of renewed nuclear tensions, his verses continue to haunt discussions. The conflict in Ukraine, the rivalry between global powers, and the spread of nuclear technology to new nations all spark fresh interpretations. His prophecies remain alive because they feed directly into humanity's most enduring fear, that our brilliance and ambition will end in self-destruction. But there's another way to see these verses. Perhaps Nostradamus did not literally foresee nuclear weapons, but instead tapped into a timeless anxiety, the knowledge that humanity's greatest danger would always come from itself. In this reading, Fire from the Sky is not about missiles or bombs, but about the arrogance of mankind in believing it could master forces too great to control. His warnings, then, are less about prediction and more about human nature, the endless cycle of invention, ambition, and the risk of annihilation. Regardless of how one interprets them, Nostradamus's nuclear prophecies strike at something visceral. Unlike plagues or earthquakes, which are natural disasters beyond human command, nuclear fire is entirely of our own making. It is a catastrophe born of intelligence and ingenuity, a disaster built in laboratories and fueled by politics. This makes it far more terrifying, because if the prophecy is true, then we ourselves are its architects. And so, whenever tensions rise, when missiles are tested, when nations threaten war, when leaders speak of unimaginable consequences, Nostradamus' name is whispered again. His shadow falls across the headlines. His quatrains unearthed to remind us that perhaps our fate has already been written. Whether prophecy or poetry, his warnings continue to resonate, because the threat of nuclear fire has never truly gone away. In the end, his verses serve as both omen and mirror. They may not prove that the future is fixed, but they force us to ask whether we are steering toward it willingly. Nostradamus may not have seen mushroom clouds, but his warnings of fire and ruin remind us that our greatest danger lies not in the stars, nor in the earth, but in ourselves. For centuries, Nostradamus' verses have drifted through history like fragments of an unfinished riddle. But in the modern world, an age of mass communication, cinema, and the internet, his words have taken on a life of their own. No longer confined to dusty books and libraries, his quatrains are now woven into popular culture, conspiracy theories, and viral media. Nostradamus has become more than a Renaissance astrologer. He is a cultural icon, a name that instantly evokes mystery, doom, and the possibility of destiny. The 20th century was a turning point. His quatrains were reprinted in bestsellers, quoted in newspapers, and dramatized in radio broadcasts during World War II. In fact, propaganda ministers on both sides of the conflict exploited his reputation. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda chief, published manipulated versions of his prophecies to suggest that Germany's victory was inevitable. Meanwhile, Allied forces countered with their own pamphlets, claiming Nostradamus had foretold Hitler's defeat. It was the ultimate irony. The same man's words were used to inspire both hope and fear, depending on who was quoting them. After the war, Nostradamus' mystique only deepened. In the 1960s and 70s, paperback books about his predictions flooded the market, turning him into a household name. Television documentaries presented him as a prophet of modern times, while sensational magazines tied his quatrains to everything from the assassination of John F. Kennedy to the Vietnam War. Each new global crisis sent people scrambling back to his texts, eager to find reassurance or warning that someone had seen it all coming. Cinema and television embraced him as well. From apocalyptic thrillers to historical dramas, Nostradamus was portrayed as a visionary figure whose words could shape the fate of nations. Hollywood often used his name as shorthand for a prophecy of doom, cementing his reputation in the public imagination. Even when his actual verses were vague or misquoted, the power of his myth carried the story forward. To mention Nostradamus was to invoke the authority of a man who, supposedly, had glimpsed tomorrow. The arrival of the digital age gave his legacy a new stage. When the internet spread across the globe in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Nostradamus became one of its earliest viral prophets. Hoax prophecies were widely circulated through emails, claiming he had predicted events like 9/11 with uncanny precision. One of the most famous examples was a fabricated verse about two steel birds falling from the sky upon the metropolis, which many believed referred to the attacks on the Twin Towers. Though completely false, it spread rapidly, proving how easily his name could lend weight to fear. This trend has only accelerated in the age of social media. Every time a tragedy occurs, Whether a natural disaster, a terrorist attack, or a global pandemic, Nostradamus' name surges in searches and hashtags. Videos on YouTube claim he foresaw COVID-19, articles declare he predicted political upheavals, and memes twist his words into both comedy and terror. Nostradamus, in effect, has become the prophet of the internet age, not because his verses are clearer, but because they thrive on uncertainty, open to endless reinterpretation. Conspiracy theorists have found in him a powerful ally. His vagueness allows almost any narrative to be grafted onto his quatrains. Doomsday preachers point to his supposed visions of the apocalypse. Political commentators cite him as proof of global schemes and hidden agendas. Fringe theorists even suggest that Nostradamus was not just an astrologer, but a time traveler, a mystic granted glimpses of our era through supernatural means. The more implausible the theory, the more easily Nostradamus' name is used to legitimize it. Yet his influence is not confined to the fringes. Even mainstream culture treats him with a mixture of fascination and respect. Documentaries continue to be made, books continue to sell, and his name remains a reliable magnet for attention. He embodies a human desire to know what lies ahead, to believe that history is not random chaos but part of a script that has already been written. Nostradamus offers the illusion of certainty in uncertain times. But his presence in modern imagination also raises deeper questions. Why do we keep turning to him, century after century? Perhaps because his verses are not just predictions, they are mirrors. They reflect whatever we fear most at a given moment. In the Renaissance, that fear was plague and religious war. In the 20th century, it was world wars and nuclear annihilation. In the 21st century, it is terrorism, pandemics, and climate change. Nostradamus remains relevant not because he foresaw these things, but because his language is flexible enough to contain them all. The persistence of his legend also speaks to a psychological need. Humans crave patterns, and in the face of uncertainty, prophecy offers comfort. Nostradamus provides a narrative that suggests there is order in chaos, that disasters are not meaningless, but part of a larger plan. Whether one believe he truly saw the future or not, his quatrains provide a way to cope with fear, transforming random tragedy into destiny. And so, in the modern imagination, Nostradamus is both prophet and storyteller, doomsayer and entertainer. He appears in documentaries, novels, movies, and viral posts, his words bending to fit the anxieties of each new generation. His legacy is not one of static prediction, but a continual reinvention. Every age finds in him exactly what it fears, and exactly what it longs to understand. The myth of Nostradamus has outgrown the man himself. What began as a work of a Renaissance physician-astrologer has become a living narrative that stretches across centuries, shaped by interpreters, skeptics, and dreamers alike. And in that sense, Nostradamus has achieved something even prophecy could not guarantee: immortality. His name endures, as much a part of modern culture as it was of the courts and kingdoms of his own day. At last, we arrive at the closing chapter of Nostradamus' enduring legend, a conclusion not found in his quatrains, but in the way his name has lived on through centuries of curiosity, fear, and fascination. Unlike a novel, history does not have a tidy ending, and Nostradamus himself never claimed to reveal one. His verses do not provide a single, definitive prophecy that ties the story of humanity together. Instead, they leave us with something far more potent, the mystery of possibility. And that mystery, more than anything else, is the key to his immortality. Throughout our exploration, one truth has emerged again and again. Nostradamus was not merely a man of predictions, but a man of symbols. His words survive not because they map the future with perfect accuracy, but because they speak to universal concerns: war, plague, famine, rebirth. These are themes that repeat throughout human history, ensuring his verses will always feel current, always feel like they belong to the present moment. When one era passes, another takes up the same lines, reshaping them to fit its own anxieties. Nostradamus is not a prophet of tomorrow alone. He is a mirror of humanity itself. And yet, the fascination with his supposed final revelations remains strong. Readers have often searched for the ultimate prophecy, the one that might foretell the world's end. Some interpreters claim he hinted at an apocalypse in the distant future, a great fire from the sky, or a universal judgment. Others argue his quatrains describe cycles of history that will continue indefinitely, with humanity rising and falling in endless repetition. What unites these interpretations is not certainty but longing, the longing to know how the story ends. For in every human heart lies the same question: what is the destiny of our world? But perhaps Nostradamus' greatest revelation is not about destruction, but about continuity. The very survival of his work across nearly 5 centuries proves that ideas can endure long after lives have ended. He died in 1566, a physician laid to rest in provincial France, and yet his name resonates more powerfully today than it did during his own lifetime. This is a form of prophecy in itself, not a prediction of events, but a demonstration of how words, once spoken, can ripple through time and shape imaginations far beyond their origin. His legacy shows us that immortality is not only found in predictions, but in the human capacity to keep stories alive. In contemplating the final revelation of Nostradamus, we also confront our own relationship with time. Humanity has always searched for glimpses of the future, for signs that tomorrow is not chaos but part of an ordered design. We peer into stars, consult oracles, and read the cryptic words of seers like Nostradamus, because deep down we yearn for reassurance. The unknown terrifies us, but prophecy softens its edges. It tells us that even if disaster comes, it comes with meaning, that our struggles and sorrows are not random, but woven into a cosmic plan. In this sense, Nostradamus offers not answers but solace. Yet his final revelation may also be a warning. If his words are endlessly flexible, then they remind us of the danger of shaping truth to fit fate. Time and again, his verses have been misquoted, distorted, and weaponized, turned into propaganda or sensational headlines. This reveals as much about us as it does about him. It shows our willingness to bend history to suit our own narratives, to find certainty even in shadows. Nostradamus forces us to ask, do we truly seek truth? Or do we seek only the comfort of believing someone has seen it already? In the end, perhaps the true final revelation lies not in Nostradamus' quatrains, but in the silence between them. He left gaps, ambiguities, and contradictions not because he failed, but because he understood something essential about prophecy. It is not meant to trap the future in a cage, but to keep the imagination alive. His words endure not because they solve the puzzle of time, but because they keep the puzzle unsolved. And in that open space, generation after generation continues to project its fears, its hopes, and its endless wonder. So what does Nostradamus ultimately teach us? That the future cannot be known in absolute detail. That even the greatest seer leaves behind only fragments, riddles, and symbols. But in those fragments lies something enduring, the human desire to search. To search for meaning in chaos, to search for patterns in history, to search for reassurance that the road ahead is not blind. Nostradamus' final revelation is not about predicting tomorrow. It is about revealing who we are today. He reminds us that prophecy is as much about the present as it is about the future. When we read his quatrains, we are not only looking ahead, we are looking inward. We are uncovering the truths of our own fears, our own struggles, our own sense of destiny. Nostradamus did not give humanity a map of time. He gave us a mirror, and in that mirror, each age has seen its reflection. As we step away from his story, one last thought lingers. Nostradamus never truly dies. His body rests in France, his time long past, but his voice remains alive wherever people dare to ask, what comes next? He is present in books, in films, in the whispers of conspiracy, in the glow of a smartphone screen as someone searches his name after a global tragedy. His verses have transcended the grave, continuing to shape the way we think about destiny itself. That, perhaps, is his final revelation, that a man can live forever, not in body, not in prophecy fulfilled, but in the endless questions his words inspire. So we leave Nostradamus here, not with finality, but with continuity. His legacy flows forward, like a river that never dries, a mystery that never closes. The final revelation is that there is no final revelation, only the eternal dance of prophecy and imagination, of history and hope. And in that dance, Nostradamus will always have a place, forever standing at the threshold between the known and the unknown, whispering from the shadows of time. Though Nostradamus himself is long gone, his voice continues to echo across the corridors of time, reaching us in moments when we feel history tightening its grip upon the present. His words are no longer confined to dusty tomes or scholarly circles. They have taken on a life of their own, living within culture, politics, art, and even our collective subconscious. This is not just a legacy of a man, it is the echo of an idea reverberating endlessly because it speaks to something primal in the human condition. In every age, humanity finds itself standing at the edge of uncertainty, gazing forward into an abyss of questions. Wars erupt, empires crumble, diseases spread, technologies transform society, and through it all, people ask, what comes next? It is this question that gives Nostradamus his eternal relevance. He does not so much answer the question as he legitimizes it, giving voice to our restlessness. His quatrains, half-veiled and half-lit, serve as companions in the darkness, reminding us that the yearning for foresight is as old as civilization itself. Consider how his echoes have appeared in different times. In the 17th century, his followers looked at civil wars and royal executions, claiming they were foretold. In the 19th century, interpreters tied his words to Napoleon, seeing in the emperor both a destroyer and a figure of destiny. In the 20th century, his name exploded into global consciousness, tethered to the rise of Hitler, the tragedy of Hiroshima, and the Cold War's shadow. Even now, in the 21st century, every new conflict, every pandemic, every technological leap is measured against his writings. It is as if his voice has become a drumbeat that matches the pulse of history itself. But what gives these echoes their staying power? The answer lies partly in ambiguity. Nostradamus did not write straightforward predictions with names and dates. He cloaked them in riddles, images, and metaphors. To some, this is evidence of manipulation, a clever way to ensure relevance long after the ink dried. But to others, it is the very reason his work feels timeless. Ambiguity is not a weakness here. It is a fuel that allows each generation to interpret him anew, to hear his voice differently as the world changes. A fixed prophecy can be disproven. A veiled one can live forever. These echoes are not just heard in moments of crisis. They permeate heart and imagination, shaping novels, films, and songs. Nostradamus has been portrayed as a shadowy oracle in countless cultural retellings, his name invoked whenever mystery or doom is needed. His voice has been twisted into horror, transformed into inspiration, and even parodied in satire. But no matter the tone, he remains unforgettable. Few historical figures have achieved such a peculiar immortality, the kind that allows their words to slip across genres, across centuries, across languages, while never losing their mystique. Yet there is a deeper resonance at play. Nostradamus represents more than prophecy. He represents a bridge between human fragility and human imagination. In his time, the plague devoured towns, will consume nations, and the stability of life could collapse overnight. Today, though our threats look different, climate change, artificial intelligence, pandemics, the underlying fear remains the same. How fragile is our tomorrow? In this way, Nostradamus' echoes remind us that across all eras, humanity has been bound by the same anxieties. We may have changed our tools, but not our questions. Still, there is danger in these echoes. They can be manipulated, twisted to serve the agendas of power. Throughout history, leaders, preachers, and opportunists have seized upon Nostradamus' name to validate their warnings, to spread fear, or to justify actions. His quatrains have been cited to recruit followers, to inflame nations, to profit from panic. These manipulations show us how echoes, once unleashed, can become storms. They remind us that the voice of Nostradamus is not neutral. It carries the weight of interpretation, and interpretation can be weaponized. And yet, the fascination endures. When disaster strikes, people instinctively turn back to him, searching for proof that the tragedy was foreseen. It is as though the knowledge that someone already knew could lessen the sting of chaos, could give suffering a sense of meaning. In this, the echoes reveal not just his power, but ours. For it is we who breathe life into his verses, we who give them shape and context. Nostradamus provided the seed. Humanity has watered it endlessly with fear, curiosity, and awe. The echoes also invite reflection on the very nature of time. Nostradamus does not speak in linear forecasts, but in cycles, wars recurring, rulers rising and falling, disasters returning like waves upon a shore. Perhaps this is his truest prophecy, that history itself is an echo chamber, repeating its themes in different forms across the centuries. If this is true, then his writings are not about predicting singular events, but about pointing to the rhythms of human existence. In every echo we hear of him, we also hear of ourselves. So where do these echoes lead us now? toward both humility and responsibility. Humility, because Nostradamus shows us the limits of certainty. His voice whispers that the future is never ours to fully know. Responsibility, because his words warn us not to surrender to fatalism. If every quatrain can be shaped anew, then so too can our actions shape the future. Nostradamus may echo across time, but it is humanity that decides how loudly, how darkly, and how destructively those echoes will sound. And perhaps that is the ultimate irony. The man who became a symbol of fate and inevitability leaves us, in truth, with the opposite choice. The future remains open, unsealed, waiting for human hands to mold it. His echoes are reminders not of destiny set in stone, but of history's constant invitation to act. As we listen one last time to Nostradamus' voice, echoing from centuries past, we recognize it for what it truly is, not a map, not a decree, but a haunting chorus that urges us to reflect on our fears, on our patterns, on our capacity both for destruction and for creation. The echoes of Nostradamus are the echoes of ourselves, carried forward into the unknown, reverberating endlessly as long as humanity dares to wonder what tomorrow will bring.